Hey guys, tonight we're going to step into a time that feels uncomfortably recent. Not the distant world of castles or plagues, but the 1930s and 1940s when people had cars, radios and newspapers, yet still believed some of the most disturbing ideas ever sold as science. This is the story of eugenics under Nazi rule. A mix of bad biology, political ambition, and outright cruelty that managed to take something dressed up as progress and turn it into justification for mass sterilization, forced experimentation, and eventually industrialized killing. It's grim, but it's also one of those moments in history where you realize how fragile reason can be when dressed up in charts, lab coats, and words like purity and hygiene. Before we get started, take a moment to make yourself comfortable. Dim the lights, settle in with a blanket, maybe let the hum of a fan play in the background. I'll do the heavy lifting of walking you through this. You don't need to remember dates or names. You don't even need to stay awake. Just let the story wash over you. Because what we're going to explore isn't just facts and figures, it's what it would feel like to be an ordinary person waking up in a world where your value, your freedom, even your right to have children was decided by the shape of your nose, the history of your grandparents, or whether a doctor thought you were worth keeping alive. So imagine opening your eyes in a small flat in Berlin, or a farmhouse in Bavaria, sometime around 1935. You hear the radio crackle with speeches about strength and renewal. Posters plaster the walls of your town telling you what an ideal family should look like. And teachers at your child's school are explaining how the nation is cleansing itself through science. The air feels modern, the streets are filled with people rushing to work. But behind it all is a machinery that classifies humans into categories of useful or useless. You're about to experience what it means when medicine stops asking how to heal, and instead starts asking who deserves to live. You open your eyes to the sound of boots on the pavement outside, a sharp rhythm that feels both ordinary and unsettling. It's the mid-1930s, and you're in Germany at a time when the word purity is everywhere. Though it doesn't mean clean air or spring water. It means people. Who should be celebrated? Who should be hidden? Who should be sterilized? Who should never exist at all? The idea has seeped into schools, newspapers, and even casual conversations in the street, as if it's just another fact of life. The posters you pass each day don't show products or theatre shows, but diagrams of family trees with branches pruned or marked with red crosses, warning you about what happens if the wrong kind of people are allowed to keep multiplying. The walls of your town are crowded with images of smiling mothers holding blonde-haired children, the so-called model family that the regime insists is the future of the nation. At first glance, it just looks like advertising, like any other political campaign that's trying to sell you an idea, but the longer you look, the more you notice what isn't there. No disabled child leaning against a parent's knee, no dark-haired faces, no families struggling in poverty. It's a vision of life scrubbed clean of imperfection, presented as if it were achievable simply by following orders and trusting the experts who call themselves scientists. It's morning and the radio hums with voices. Not music, not light chatter, but speeches declaring that the nation has been reborn, that the weak and the degenerate will no longer drag everyone else down. You sit at your table with a piece of stale bread and a cup of bitter ersatz coffee, and you hear words like hygiene, health, strength, and future repeated again and again. They sound positive on the surface, but you know they're being used to justify things that feel colder, and more mechanical. Your neighbour down the street has been taken away to a hospital and no one has seen him return. People whisper that he had some sort of mental illness, and the whispers always end the same way. Better for everyone. It's said with a shrug, as if his disappearance were as natural as the weather. When you step outside, you see the youth marching to school, their uniforms neatly pressed, their chants echoing down the street. They aren't just learning reading, writing and arithmetic anymore. They're being taught how to classify skull shapes, how to measure eye colour, how to believe that some of their classmates are biologically destined for greatness, while others are little more than parasites wasting the nation's resources. It's science class rebranded as ideology, numbers and charts twisted into proof of something no real experiment could ever confirm. The newspapers you buy at the corner store carry articles that read like medical journals but are written by propagandists. They talk about hereditary diseases, about the cost of caring for people deemed unfit, about the burden they place on hard-working citizens. There are photographs of asylum patients with captions that compare them to animals or pests. You don't see their names, only their so-called defects: schizophrenia, epilepsy, deafness, blindness, feeble-mindedness, even alcoholism. Conditions that today might be treated or supported with dignity are instead paraded as reasons for elimination. You might think that most people would be horrified, that neighbours would stand up for each other, but in this world, silence is easier. To question too loudly is to mark yourself a suspect, and no one wants that attention. Besides, the whole campaign is wrapped in the language of duty. It's not presented as cruelty. It's presented as care, as responsibility, as sacrifice for the greater good. When the government sterilises someone, it isn't called punishment, it's called prevention. When a person is removed from society, it isn't called murder, it's called mercy. Words are twisted until they no longer mean what they should, and the people around you begin to repeat them as if they've always been true. You walk through the streets and notice the architecture of the new buildings rising under the regime. They're stark, heavy, monumental, designed to feel permanent, as if this vision of purity will last forever. Inside government offices, clerks stamp documents that decide whether a marriage can be allowed, whether a child can be born, whether a patient will live another week. It's all paperwork, all bureaucratic calm, but each stamp carries a weight measured in human lives. At the doctor's office, things are no longer simple. A checkup isn't just about listening to your lungs or checking your pulse. It's about filling out forms that list your family history, every illness, every defect, every so-called weakness. A diagnosis isn't just personal anymore, it's political. Your body is no longer yours alone, it's part of the state's inventory. And if your record shows the wrong details, you might find yourself scheduled for a procedure you never consented to. People whisper about sterilizations performed without anaesthetic, about patients waking up to find they'll never have children. Some of the whispers are true, others exaggerated, but the fear they create keeps everyone in line. Children play in the street, but even their games have changed. They sing songs about health and strength, about protecting the nation from contamination. They repeat slogans without understanding them, carrying them like nursery rhymes into adulthood. It's a slow, steady conditioning, the kind that doesn't feel like indoctrination, because it's wrapped in school lessons and summer camps. By the time they're teenagers, Many of them believe what they've been taught with absolute certainty. You pass by a cinema and see the posters for films that aren't just entertainment. They're propaganda pieces designed to look like documentaries, showing images of asylum patients next to statistics about how much money they cost the state. The narration is calm, factual, clinical, as if the people on screen were just numbers in a ledger rather than individuals with names and stories. Audiences sit quietly in the dark, watching as these films argue that it's compassionate to end certain lives. Some viewers shift uncomfortably, but most nod along, absorbing the message without protest. As the day moves on, you overhear conversations in the market. A woman complains about her cousin who drinks too much, saying he should be sent away for treatment. Another man grumbles about a co-worker with epilepsy, suggesting the state should do something about people like that. These aren't officials or party members. They're ordinary citizens, echoing the slogans they've heard until they feel like their own ideas. That's how the obsession with purity spreads. Not just from the top down, but from the ground up, woven into casual talk and everyday judgment. You might try to push it out of your mind as you walk home, but the reminders are everywhere. The slogans painted on walls, the pamphlets handed out in public squares, the textbooks your children bring home from school. They all repeat the same message. The future belongs to the strong, the healthy, the pure. Everyone else is a danger, a drain, a mistake that must be corrected. It's not shouted in the streets with anger. It's whispered calmly, printed neatly, broadcast with authority, until it feels like common sense. At dinner, you sit with your family and try to eat in silence, but the radio plays in the background, whether you want it to or not. The speeches keep coming, urging citizens to report neighbours who seem defective, encouraging couples to prove their ancestry before marriage, warning against bringing more weakness into the nation. It's relentless, a drumbeat that never stops. Even if you don't agree, even if you know it's wrong, you can't escape it. And slowly, without realising it, you start adjusting the way you think, the way you speak, the way you look at people around you. When night falls, you lie awake in bed and listen to the quiet outside, broken only by the occasional distant shout or the rumble of a car on cobblestones. The posters with their perfect families still hang on the walls of the street. The files in government cabinets still sit, full of names and numbers waiting to be acted on. The doctors still sharpen their scalpels for tomorrow's procedures. Nothing about it feels temporary. It feels as though this obsession with purity has always been here, as though it's simply the way the world works now. And as you close your eyes, you realise that what you've seen today is only the surface. The sterilizations, the propaganda, the endless talk of health and strength, they're just the beginning. The machinery is being built piece by piece, and soon it won't just be about preventing certain people from having children. It will be about deciding who deserves to breathe at all. The story doesn't really begin in Germany, though it's tempting to think it does. By the time the Nazi regime wrapped eugenics in banners and slogans, the soil had already been fertilised with decades of pseudoscience. To understand how bad ideas can look like progress, you need to go back further to the late 19th century, when scientific language started wearing the mask of authority, even when the underlying theories were built on sand. The word itself, eugenics, sounds clinical, almost sterile, the kind of term you'd expect to find in a textbook rather than a political speech. It was coined by Francis Galton, a Victorian gentleman with the kind of leisure time that allowed for endless speculation dressed up as science. He was a cousin of Charles Darwin, and like many men of his class, he took Darwin's work on natural selection and twisted it into something it was never meant to justify. Where Darwin spoke about how species adapted over generations, Galton wondered aloud whether humans could hurry the process along by encouraging the right people to reproduce and discouraging the wrong ones. It sounded logical enough on paper, the way a poorly drawn flowchart can trick you into thinking it represents reality. The idea was simple. If farmers bred stronger horses by picking the best stallions, why couldn't society do the same with humans? The problem, of course, is that human beings aren't livestock, and worth can't be measured by skull size, nose length, or vague judgments about intelligence. But in an age when measuring things felt like the pinnacle of modernity, people were eager to believe it. By the early 20th century, the movement had spread far beyond Galton's drawing room musings. Eugenic societies formed across Europe and North America. They held conferences where men in suits pointed at charts showing family lineages marked with black dots, each dot representing an illness, a disability, or simply poverty. The message was clear. Undesirable traits ran in families, and the only way to protect society was to stop those families from growing. They dressed prejudice up as math, putting numbers beside words like feeble-mindedness, as if that made it objective. In the United States, the movement found fertile ground. State fairs hosted fitter family contests where smiling couples and their children were examined by panels of judges who handed out prizes to those who best matched the eugenic ideal. It was science mixed with pageantry, propaganda presented as wholesome entertainment. At the same time, sterilization laws were passed in places like Indiana, allowing the state to prevent people in prisons or mental institutions from ever having children. Courts upheld these laws, and in 1927, the US Supreme Court famously declared in Buck v. Bell that 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. That sentence, cold and dismissive, became one of the most chilling endorsements of eugenics from a government institution. Across the Atlantic, similar currents were flowing. Scandinavian countries passed their own sterilization laws, often justified by the same language of health and progress. Britain had its own eugenic society with members drawn from respected academics, politicians and doctors. These weren't fringe groups whispering in the shadows. They were mainstream, invited into the halls of power, given platforms in universities, listened to as though their ideas were unassailable truth. The language they used was always the same. They spoke of improvement, of hygiene, of reducing the burden on society. They talked about costs, how much it took to care for the sick or the disabled, how welfare funds could be better spent if only the next generation was cleansed of weakness. It wasn't presented as cruelty, it was presented as efficiency. Numbers on a balance sheet. A rational calculation that conveniently ignored the human beings whose lives were being written off. By the time Germany began to flirt with these ideas, the intellectual scaffolding was already in place. German academics attended international conferences on eugenics. German journals reprinted American articles about sterilization. The movement was global, and in many ways Germany didn't invent it so much as amplify it to extremes that others had only hinted at. In the 1920s, as the Weimar Republic struggled with economic collapse and political chaos, Eugenics offered a seductive promise. It said the nation could be strong again, not just by building industry or armies, but by sculpting the very population itself. When the Nazis rose to power, they didn't have to invent the language. They simply borrowed it, injected it with ideology, and wrapped it in the machinery of the state. You can imagine sitting in a lecture hall in Berlin around 1930, a professor at the front, pointing at a chart showing how much it cost to house a patient in an asylum compared to the cost of feeding a healthy child. The numbers are clear, the chart is persuasive, and the conclusion feels inevitable. Students take notes, nod along, convinced they are learning science rather than propaganda. The line between research and ideology blurs until there is no line at all. What had started as a speculative idea in Victorian England had become law in America, policy in Scandinavia, and doctrine in Germany. By the mid-1930s, sterilization wasn't just suggested, it was mandated. German doctors filled out forms. Judges signed off on operations. Hospitals carried them out on tens of thousands of men and women. Each case was justified with the same detached logic. Epilepsy, schizophrenia, deafness, blindness, alcoholism, even so-called asocial behaviour. The list of conditions expanded until it was less about medicine and more about control. The chilling part is how ordinary it all looked. These weren't secret midnight raids or back alley procedures. They were scheduled, documented, recorded in ledgers. Families received official letters explaining why their relative had been selected. Judges issued rulings. Surgeons performed operations in well-lit rooms. Bureaucracy gave the whole process a veneer of normalcy, as if it were no different than issuing a driver's license or collecting taxes. And the public, conditioned by years of propaganda, often accepted it. Newspapers printed stories praising the courage of the state to make hard decisions for the sake of the future. Films portrayed disabled people as burdens, their lives measured not in joy or dignity, but in how much they cost society. School children were shown math problems that asked them to calculate how many houses could be built with the money spent on supporting one unfit family. The arithmetic of cruelty became part of everyday education. By now, the word purity had taken on a life of its own. It was spoken in speeches, written in pamphlets, carved into slogans. It didn't mean clean water or healthy lungs. It meant exclusion. It meant that whole categories of people could be reduced to stains on the national fabric, and the role of science was to bleach them away. None of this felt abrupt. It was gradual, each step following logically from the one before it. First, classify, then measure, then restrict, then sterilize. Each policy seemed like an extension of the last, so that by the time people realized where it was leading, the machinery was already humming. Doctors who had once sworn to do no harm found themselves wielding scalpels not to heal but to prevent. Teachers who had once nurtured curiosity now handed out rulers to measure skulls. Politicians who had once debated budgets now debated which citizens were worth the expense of survival. And beneath it all was the illusion that this was science, that it was progress, that it was the future. The diagrams, the charts, the cost calculations gave it the weight of truth. But scratch beneath the surface, and all you found was prejudice in a lab coat, dressed up with numbers and stamped with official seals. As you think back on that time, it's tempting to imagine that people must have known better, that they must have recognised the danger. But many didn't. The movement was too widespread, the language too persuasive. the fear of speaking out too strong. By the time the Nazis took full control, the groundwork was so well laid that their policies felt like the inevitable next step in a global conversation that had already normalized the idea of human lives ranked by worth. The world had given them the vocabulary. They simply sharpened it into a weapon. And as the years moved forward, the sterilizations and classifications would prove to be only the opening act. The phrase that begins to echo through classrooms, hospitals, and government offices is racial hygiene. It sounds almost clinical, the way a doctor might speak about sterilizing instruments or cleaning a wound. But in 1930s Germany, it meant something much darker. It meant taking the language of health and applying it to people, as if entire families or communities could be diagnosed like infections, cut out like tumours, and disposed of like waste. The word hygiene gave the whole thing a sense of legitimacy, the feeling that it wasn't hatred but medicine, not prejudice but science. And that's what made it so dangerous. The foundations had been laid by the broader eugenics movement, but in Germany the idea evolved into something far more expansive. It wasn't just about preventing hereditary illness anymore. It was about purifying the nation, the folk, from within. Doctors, professors, and politicians began to use the term as if it were a medical specialty. There were journals dedicated to racial hygiene. University courses taught it alongside biology. Textbooks explained it to students as if it were no different than studying anatomy or physiology. If you were a young medical student in the mid-1930s, you could specialize in it the way today someone might choose pediatrics or cardiology. The language turned ideology into a discipline, and the discipline turned ideology into practice. Imagine being in a lecture hall in Munich in 1934. The professor projects images of different faces, profiles of men and women from various backgrounds. He talks about skull angles, hair texture, eye colour, and bloodlines as if they were reliable indicators of character. He explains that certain traits are not only undesirable but dangerous, that allowing them to spread would weaken the national body. His tone is calm, authoritative, persuasive. Students take notes diligently, absorbing ideas that would sound absurd if not wrapped in the authority of science. And when exams come around, they're asked to classify photographs, to draw distinctions between Aryan and non-Aryan features, to reproduce the charts they've been shown. Their grades depend on repeating ideology as fact. Racial hygiene became an umbrella, under which the state could gather a wide range of policies. Sterilization laws were one piece of it, but so were marriage restrictions, ancestry checks, and even lifestyle regulations. Couples were encouraged to prove their lineage before marrying. Health certificates were required to show that neither partner carried so-called hereditary defects. Posters warned against racial defilement, depicting caricatures of Jewish men threatening blonde-haired women, as if love itself were a disease that could infect the future. The message was constant. The health of the nation was at stake, and every citizen had a duty to protect it. Doctors were at the centre of it all. They weren't just healers anymore. They were gatekeepers of purity. A physician could decide whether a patient was allowed to marry, whether they were allowed to reproduce, whether they should be sterilized. Clinics didn't only treat illness, they screened for supposed racial defects. A doctor might examine a child and note down that the boy was weak-minded, or that the girl had a squint in her eye, and that note could follow them for life, stamped onto forms that determined their fate. Medicine, which should have been about protecting the vulnerable, was transformed into a tool for identifying and eliminating them. The propaganda made it all seem reasonable. Films like Erbkrank, which translates to hereditary defective, portrayed patients in mental institutions with mournful music and statistics about how much they cost the state. The narrator spoke in soothing, authoritative tones, explaining that these lives were tragic burdens and that society had a moral responsibility to prevent more such suffering. Viewers sat in darkened theatres, nodding along, believing they were watching truth rather than carefully staged persuasion. Newspapers echoed the same message, publishing articles about degeneracy as if they were scientific reports. Even children's books carried the theme, teaching young readers that strong, healthy families were good for the nation, while others dragged it down. It's important to see how the language worked. By calling it hygiene, the regime tapped into something people already accepted. Everyone understands the importance of washing hands, cleaning wounds, keeping environments sanitary. The metaphor extended easily. Just as germs could contaminate the body, so too could unwanted traits contaminate the nation. Once people accepted the metaphor, the rest followed almost naturally. If hygiene required disinfecting, then racial hygiene required sterilizing. If hygiene meant removing rot, then racial hygiene meant eliminating the diseased. The analogy was simple, and its simplicity made it powerful. You might picture a family in a small town being told they need to provide their ancestry certificates for a marriage license. They dutifully gather baptismal records and family documents, tracing back generations to prove their purity. They hand them over to the local official, who stamps them with approval if the lineage is satisfactory. If not, the marriage is denied and the family shamed. It's all done with paperwork, with stamps, with forms, making it look like any other bureaucratic process. But behind each denial is a human cost, a relationship ended, a life trajectory altered by a policy that treats love like contamination. The obsession with purity extended even to children. Schools distributed questionnaires asking about family health histories. Teachers noted down which students seemed slow, clumsy or different, feeding that information into a growing network of files. Children themselves were tested, measured, classified. A boy who struggled with reading might be labelled feeble-minded. A girl with a physical disability might be marked as unfit. Those labels weren't private. They could follow a child into adulthood, limiting opportunities, subjecting them to sterilization, or sending them to institutions where the future grew very narrow very quickly. Behind all of this was a deeper goal: to create a society where everyone internalized the obsession with purity. Citizens were encouraged to police themselves and each other. Posters urged healthy couples to have more children, while at the same time encouraging people to report those who seemed defective. The state didn't need to monitor every interaction if neighbours, teachers, and even family members absorbed the logic of racial hygiene and applied it themselves. It became a social expectation, a way to demonstrate loyalty, a sign of being modern and enlightened. Medical journals played their part too. Articles published in professional outlets used clinical language to describe sterilization cases, as if they were simply discussing routine treatments. Statistics about the number of operations performed were presented like achievements, evidence of progress. Doctors wrote about patients as though they were case studies rather than individuals, their humanity erased in favour of labels and categories. For a young doctor reading those journals, it would be easy to believe that participating in these policies was not only acceptable but expected, even noble. It wasn't just doctors, of course. Bureaucrats, teachers, judges, midwives, police, all were drawn into the system. Each played a small role, often one that could be justified as administrative rather than ideological. A clerk stamped a form. A teacher filled out a report. A judge signed an order. No single act felt like cruelty, but together they formed a machinery that sorted, sterilized, and excluded on an industrial scale. The genius of the system, if you can call it that, was how it dispersed responsibility so that no one person felt entirely accountable. By the late 1930s, the myth of racial hygiene had become so ingrained that it didn't even feel like propaganda anymore. It was the air people breathed, the background noise of daily life. The posters on the wall, the radio broadcasts, the school lessons, the lectures, all repeated the same message until it seemed self-evident. When ideas are repeated often enough, people stop questioning them. And that's what made this particular myth so resilient. The thing to remember is that none of it was real science. There were no controlled studies proving that poverty was inherited, or that criminality ran in bloodlines, or that epilepsy made someone less human. But the veneer of charts, diagrams, and Latin terminology gave the impression of rigour. To the average citizen, it sounded convincing. To the medical community, it became professional orthodoxy. To the regime, it was the perfect justification for policies that would have seemed unthinkable without the mask of medicine. So when you think about racial hygiene in Nazi Germany, don't picture wild-eyed fanatics shouting in the streets. Picture calm lectures, neatly printed pamphlets, carefully filed paperwork. Picture the doctor with a stethoscope around his neck, who also signs a sterilization order. Picture the teacher who gives a math problem about the cost of supporting a disabled child. Picture the judge who declares a marriage invalid because the family tree doesn't branch the right way. The horror wasn't in the chaos. It was in the order, the routine, the normalization of cruelty disguised as care. And while all of this was unfolding, while citizens were adjusting to the idea that purity was the highest form of health, the next step was already being prepared. Sterilization and marriage restrictions were only the beginning. Once a society accepts that some lives are less valuable than others, it doesn't stop at prevention. It starts to consider removal. The machinery of racial hygiene wasn't built to stop where it began. It was always moving towards something more final. By the time racial hygiene was accepted as medicine, the next step felt almost inevitable. If purity was the goal, then someone had to decide who met the standard and who didn't. It wasn't left vague for long. The state created systems, procedures, and offices devoted to sorting people into categories. Your worth could be reduced to a check mark in a file, your future determined by the conclusions of a committee that had never even spoken to you. To live in Nazi Germany was to live under constant evaluation, as if you were a specimen on a lab bench, inspected not for who you were, but for how you compared to an artificial ideal. It often began with forms. The bureaucracy loved paperwork, and there seemed to be no shortage of questionnaires. Doctors, teachers, and employers were all expected to collect information, filling in boxes about family history, health conditions, and behaviour. If your child struggled in school, the teacher might write slow or retarded in the report, which would then be passed up to local authorities. If a doctor noted epilepsy or depression, The form was copied into files that could follow you for years. Each note became a data point, and those points were used to decide whether you were fit to marry, to reproduce, or to continue living freely. The categories themselves weren't as scientific as they appeared. Terms like hereditary feeble-mindedness were applied broadly, often with no clear definition. A girl who was shy, a boy who was restless, an adult who struggled to keep a job. Any of them could fall under the label if an official decided they did. Alcoholism was considered hereditary. So was criminality. Poverty too. If your family had been poor for generations, officials argued that the cause wasn't circumstance, but biology. Whole lineages were stamped with the word unfit, as though hardship itself were genetic. One of the most chilling aspects was how ordinary professionals participated. Teachers became scouts, identifying children who didn't measure up. Midwives reported on infants who seemed frail or deformed. Employers filled out evaluations of workers, noting whether they were reliable or prone to illness. Each piece of information fed into a growing network of classification. A man who thought his doctor's visit was private might later discover that his file had been forwarded to a health court, where judges and medical experts decided whether he should be sterilised. Privacy was an illusion. Every detail of your life was potential evidence against you. The process was designed to look impartial. Health courts were established where panels of judges and doctors reviewed cases. They used charts, pedigrees, and medical reports to decide whether someone should be sterilised. On paper, it resembled a legal proceeding, complete with hearings and decisions. In reality, the outcome was almost always predetermined. Appeals rarely succeeded, and once the order was given, it was carried out swiftly. By the late 1930s, hundreds of thousands of people had been sterilised under these laws. Their classification as unfit formalised by official stamps and signatures. The criteria could be absurdly broad. Conditions like deafness or blindness, which had no bearing on a person's intelligence or ability to contribute, were treated as hereditary flaws requiring elimination. Schizophrenia and epilepsy were targeted relentlessly, often without solid diagnosis. Even being labelled asocial could be enough, a vague category that encompassed everything from homelessness to nonconformity. The state had created a net so wide that nearly anyone could be caught in it if officials chose. The obsession with classification extended to race as well. Genealogical charts became mandatory for anyone seeking marriage approval, requiring proof of Aryan ancestry back several generations. Families scoured baptismal records and church registries, producing stacks of documents to demonstrate their purity. One missing certificate, one questionable surname, one rumour about a grandmother's heritage could derail the entire process. Bureaucrats pored over these files, drawing lines through family trees, labelling branches as contaminated. Marriage wasn't a matter of love or compatibility anymore. It was a matter of racial arithmetic. Propaganda reinforced these categories. Posters showed side-by-side images of fit and unfit individuals. The first smiling, healthy blonde, the second slouched, dark-haired, or depicted with visible disability. The captions explained that one contributed to the future, while the other drained resources. Films presented dramatizations where noble, healthy families contrasted with the burden of caring for the mentally ill. These images were designed to make the classification seem obvious, natural, undeniable. By the time citizens encountered real cases in their communities, they had already been trained to see them through the lens of fit and unfit. Imagine standing in line at a government office, waiting for a marriage license. Couples around you clutch folders of family documents, nervous not because of romance, but because of paperwork. A clerk flips through your file, checks the boxes, compares names to registries. If everything matches, the stamp comes down and you're allowed to proceed. If not, your application is denied. There's no appeal, no argument. The official explanation is that it's about protecting the nation's health. In reality, it's about reducing human lives to categories in a filing cabinet. The classification system didn't stop at individuals. Entire institutions were organised around it. Schools for the so-called feeble-minded were expanded, not to educate, but to segregate. Asylums grew crowded with people deemed unfit, their files marked with notes that would later justify sterilization or worse. Camps for vagrants and the homeless emerged, labelled as centres for rehabilitation, but functioning more as holding pens for those who didn't fit the mould. The bureaucracy of classification stretched its reach into every corner of life, quietly labelling, sorting, and discarding. Even marriage counselling centres were established, staffed with officials trained in racial hygiene. Couples seeking to wed were required to attend, where their family histories were scrutinised, and their compatibility judged not on affection, but on genetics. If the counsellors decided the pairing wasn't ideal, the couple could be discouraged or outright forbidden. The state had inserted itself into the most personal aspects of life, treating love as a transaction subject to approval. The irony is that while officials spoke of objectivity, the system was riddled with bias. Wealthy families could sometimes manoeuvre around restrictions, using influence to secure favourable evaluations. Poor families had no such recourse. A factory worker's son might be classified unfit for minor issues that a professor's child could easily escape. The classifications were less about genetics than about reinforcing social hierarchies under the guise of science. This sorting process also provided a foundation for later policies. Once people accepted the idea that society could be divided into fit and unfit, the leap to more extreme measures became easier. If unfit individuals were a burden, then why stop at sterilization? Why not remove them entirely? The categories created in files and forms paved the way for the T4 program, where classification shifted from sterilization to euthanasia. By then, the public had been conditioned to see the unfit not as neighbours, but as problems to be solved. You can imagine the quiet dread of receiving a letter from a health court, summoning you to a hearing. You sit in a waiting room with others, each clutching papers, faces tense. Inside, a panel reviews your file, perhaps asks a few perfunctory questions. The decision is read out with bureaucratic detachment. You leave not knowing when or where, only that soon you'll be scheduled for an operation that will end your ability to have children. There's no crime, no trial, no defence. Just classification, verdict, and procedure. The chilling efficiency of the system lay in its banality. No dramatic arrests, no public trials, just forms, stamps and signatures. Teachers doing their jobs, doctors filling out reports, clerks processing files. Each step felt small, but together they created a machinery that stripped people of dignity and autonomy. And because it was wrapped in the language of science and hygiene, it was easy for many to accept it as progress rather than persecution. By the late 1930s, classifications touched nearly everyone in Germany. Even if you were considered fit, you had to prove it constantly through ancestry certificates, health exams, and marriage approvals. Citizens lived under the shadow of being evaluated, of being placed into a category that might not align with their own sense of self. Identity wasn't yours to define anymore. It was assigned by the state, written in files, stamped onto documents, decided by strangers. And once you were stamped unfit, there was no going back. The file followed you, the label became permanent, and the machinery of sterilization or segregation took over. The categories weren't just descriptions, they were destinies. Once people were divided into fit and unfit on paper, the state wanted something more tangible to point at, something you could hold up in a lecture or show on a poster. That's where the obsession with measuring bodies really took hold. If you were told you were unfit, there had to be proof, and proof came in the form of rulers, calipers, and endless charts of human anatomy. Entire departments of so-called researchers devoted themselves to taking measurements of skulls, noses, foreheads, and jawlines, convinced that the secrets of worth and weakness could be captured in centimetres. It wasn't new, of course. Phrenology and racial anthropology had been floating around since the 19th century, with men in waistcoats running their hands over skulls and claiming to read character traits from bumps on the head. By the 1930s, those older pseudosciences had been dressed up with a more official name, racial science, and in Germany they were elevated to the status of national truth. Universities established institutes of racial biology where professors didn't just lecture on human anatomy, they taught students how to categorize entire populations by facial angles and cranial volumes. Imagine being a child in school and lining up while a teacher or nurse pressed a caliper against your temples. They noted down the width of your skull, the distance between your eyes, the shape of your nose. They compared these numbers to charts showing the so-called Aryan ideal. If your measurements aligned, you were praised. If not, you were marked as questionable. You weren't just learning math or history anymore. You were being measured like livestock, your body reduced to data that supposedly revealed your worth. The images produced by these studies were plastered everywhere. Posters in classrooms and public spaces displayed diagrams of heads and noses, labelling them as Nordic, Alpine, Mediterranean, or Jewish. The Nordic type was always depicted as strong, upright, handsome, the image of health. The Jewish type was exaggerated into grotesque caricature, with hooked noses, heavy eyelids, and receding chins. The labels were pseudoscience masquerading as fact, but to the average citizen they looked authoritative. If it was printed in a textbook, or explained by a teacher in a white coat, it must be true. Anthropologists travelled into villages with suitcases full of measuring tools, photographing families, recording eye colours, hair shades, and head shapes. They collected this data as though cataloguing wildlife, convinced they were uncovering the biology of the nation. Whole communities were subjected to these inspections, each person photographed from the front and in profile, each measurement written into files that could later be used to determine whether you belonged. It was invasive, humiliating, and often terrifying, but it was presented as neutral science. Citizens lined up quietly, because saying no wasn't really an option. The obsession went beyond skulls. Doctors examined ears, teeth, posture, even how people walked. The smallest irregularity could be turned into evidence of degeneracy. If your jaw jutted too far, if your nose curved too sharply, if your ears stuck out. These details could be used to argue that you carried undesirable traits. There was no escape from scrutiny. Even the healthiest, most ordinary person might be told their body carried hidden signs of contamination. And once those signs were noted in your file, they stayed with you. Universities churned out dissertations filled with photographs and measurements. Students aspiring to careers in medicine or anthropology learned how to wield calipers and compasses the way others learned how to hold stethoscopes. They weren't healing anyone, they were sorting, labelling, reducing. The academic tone gave it all an air of respectability, but the end result was always the same. Some people passed, others failed, and the failures were marked as unfit for marriage, reproduction, or life itself. What made this obsession effective was how mundane it looked. A photograph of a man's profile, a list of measurements, a diagram comparing nose angles. It all appeared objective, like the product of careful study. There were no shouts or slogans in the lab, only rulers, ink, and paperwork. But each line on a chart was a step toward exclusion. Each measurement justified policies that treated people as if they were defective machines rather than human beings. Think of the families required to provide ancestry certificates. When a marriage application looked suspicious, officials didn't just check the documents. They called in anthropologists to measure the couple, to photograph their features, to decide whether their bodies matched their papers. A man might prove his grandparents were Aryan on paper, but if his nose looked wrong under a caliper, suspicions lingered. A woman might have every certificate in order, but if her skull shape resembled the diagrams of the undesirable types, her marriage could be delayed or denied. Bureaucracy merged with biology, turning love into a series of measurements. The Nazis used these measurements not only to police the present, but to imagine the future. Charts depicted what the nation would look like if unfit people kept reproducing. They showed exaggerated faces multiplying across generations, warning that the German people would be overrun by weakness. Other charts depicted the opposite: tall, blonde, blue-eyed children marching into the future. A nation purified by careful breeding. These images appeared in classrooms, pamphlets, even magazines, training people to see biology as destiny, and destiny as something the state had the right to control. The obsession with skulls and noses wasn't just about classification, it was also about justification. By reducing people to physical traits, it became easier to argue that they weren't truly individuals at all. There were examples, types, cases. A man wasn't just himself. He was representative of a contaminated lineage. A woman wasn't just a person. She was a carrier of defective blood. When you stop seeing someone as an individual, stripping them of rights becomes easier. Measurements were a way of erasing humanity behind numbers. There were moments when the absurdity of it all peeked through. Anthropologists sometimes contradicted one another. A nose that one chart described as Aryan might appear on another chart as Jewish. A skull measurement might fall into multiple categories depending on the source. But these inconsistencies didn't matter. The point wasn't accuracy, it was authority. The act of measuring itself was enough to create the illusion of truth. Once the numbers were written down, they carried weight, even if they proved nothing. For the people being measured, there was little room to protest. Refusal could be interpreted as guilt, as proof you had something to hide. Submitting was humiliating but safer. Children grew up knowing their bodies could be inspected at any time, their worth quantified by rulers and charts. Adults learned that their faces might betray them, no matter what their document said. A society obsessed with measurement turned everyone into potential suspects, their features scanned for signs of contamination. The influence of these practices spread far beyond classrooms and clinics. Military recruitment centres used measurements to select ideal soldiers. Marriage bureaus used them to approve unions. Even artists and filmmakers drew on the imagery, shaping characters that embodied the Aryan ideal or its opposite. The caliper became more than a scientific tool. It became a cultural symbol of who belonged and who didn't. By the end of the 1930s, millions of measurements had been taken, thousands of files created, endless photographs archived. None of it made anyone healthier. None of it cured disease or eased suffering. But it created a mountain of paper that gave the illusion of legitimacy. When sterilizations were ordered, when marriages were denied, when people were sent to institutions, officials could point to the files, the charts, the photographs. They could say, look, this isn't hatred, it's science. And that illusion of science was often enough to silence doubt. As the system grew more entrenched, the measurements became less about proving unfitness and more about reinforcing ideology. Even if someone's skull fit perfectly into the so-called Aryan category, the act of being measured reminded them that their body was not their own. It belonged to the state, subject to inspection, classification, and judgment. The constant scrutiny kept people compliant, wary of standing out, eager to conform. Measuring skulls wasn't just about data, it was about control. And while all this went on in classrooms, clinics, and offices, the groundwork was being laid for something even more invasive. If a caliper could decide whether you were fit to marry, what else could medicine be used for? If photographs and charts could justify sterilization, what other procedures might be justified next? The rulers and diagrams were only the beginning. The scalpel was waiting. Once the rulers and calipers had finished their work, once the charts and family trees had been filed, the next step was to act on the classifications. A theory wasn't enough anymore. The state wanted results, and results meant surgery. In 1933, almost as soon as the Nazi regime came to power, the law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring was passed. The language sounded bureaucratic, even compassionate on the surface. But in practice, it was the machinery that turned eugenics into something permanent, irreversible, and brutally physical. The law listed conditions considered hereditary and therefore undesirable. Schizophrenia, epilepsy, blindness, deafness, hereditary feeble-mindedness, manic depression, physical deformities, even severe alcoholism. If you were diagnosed with any of these, the state could order your sterilization. The justification was simple and chilling. By preventing you from having children, they were protecting the health of the nation. Officials called it a preventive measure, as if it were a vaccine. Except instead of preventing disease, it prevented people. Health courts were established across the country to process cases. They were staffed by doctors, judges, and bureaucrats, each sitting on panels that decided who would be sterilized. Citizens were summoned, their files laid out, their family history scrutinized. A hearing was held, but it was hardly a trial. The outcome was almost always the same. Once the label hereditary was attached to a condition, sterilization was the prescribed solution. Appeals were possible in theory, but they rarely succeeded. Once a file had been marked, the surgery was inevitable. Imagine being a young man diagnosed with epilepsy. You receive a letter ordering you to appear before the health court. You arrive at a government office where officials in black robes and white coats ask perfunctory questions about your health, your family, your work. They don't really need your answers. The paperwork already says enough. At the end, the decision is read out. You are to be sterilized. The word hangs in the air, cold and absolute. You protest, but the judges have already moved on to the next case. Hospitals became the sites where policy turned into practice. Patients were admitted not for healing, but for surgery that stripped them of the ability to reproduce. Men underwent vasectomies, often hastily performed. Women endured tubal ligations, sometimes without proper anaesthesia, sometimes with little explanation beyond a vague statement about it being necessary for the future. The operations were often rushed, performed in bulk. The patients wheeled in and out like products on a conveyor belt. Complications were common, infections frequent, deaths not unheard of. But to the officials overseeing the program, these were acceptable costs. By the end of the decade, more than 350,000 people had been sterilized under the law. Entire institutions were emptied of reproductive futures. Asylums, schools for the disabled, psychiatric hospitals, all became pipelines feeding into operating rooms. A patient admitted for depression might leave unable to have children. A woman checked into a maternity clinic with complications might be sterilized while under anesthesia without her knowledge or consent. For many, the first time they fully understood what had happened was after the fact, when the realization hit that their ability to have a family had been taken away permanently. The law blurred the line between medicine and punishment. Officially, sterilization wasn't framed as a penalty. It was preventative, hygienic, rational. But for those subjected to it, it felt like a sentence. It carried the same finality as prison, the same intrusion as physical assault, and the same stigma as being branded. Once sterilized, you carried the label of unfit forever. Neighbours knew, employers knew, sometimes even your children were told. The operation marked you not just physically, but socially. Doctors carried out the procedures with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some were true believers, convinced they were serving science and the state by cutting off defective lineages. Others were more reluctant, but compliance was safer than resistance. Refusing to participate could cost a career, and many rationalized their involvement by telling themselves it was inevitable anyway. A few tried to shield patients, offering misleading diagnoses to protect them, but these were rare exceptions. For the most part, the medical profession complied. What made the program so effective was its bureaucracy. Every step was recorded, every operation documented, every file archived. Reports tallied the number of sterilizations performed each month, the percentage of appeals denied, the distribution across regions. The data was presented in meetings as evidence of progress. To officials, each statistic wasn't a person, but an achievement. The more operations performed, the healthier the nation was said to be. It was presented as a public health campaign, no different than eradicating smallpox or improving sanitation. Propaganda supported the effort, making sterilization seem not only acceptable but necessary. Pamphlets explained how much money was spent caring for the hereditarily ill, showing that a single family could cost the state thousands of Reichsmarks over generations. Films depicted disabled individuals as tragic burdens, their lives painted as hopeless, their reproduction framed as selfish. School books included math problems where children calculated how many new houses that could be built if fewer defective children were born. Sterilization was cast as an act of social responsibility, even kindness, preventing suffering before it began. The cruelty lay in how ordinary it was made to seem. Citizens read about sterilizations in newspapers as if they were routine medical updates. Doctors spoke about them in clinical terms, discussing techniques and outcomes at conferences. Judges signed orders with the same detachment they applied to civil disputes. It became part of the background, one more bureaucratic function of the state. For those not directly affected, it was easy to ignore, to shrug and assume it was for the best. But for those caught in the system, the experience was devastating. Men described the humiliation of being inspected, questioned, and declared defective. Women wrote about the shock of waking from surgery to discover what had been done. Families mourned futures that had been stolen, entire lineages cut off by the stroke of a pen. And yet their voices were rarely heard. To speak out was dangerous, and most remained silent, bearing their loss in private while the machinery rolled on. The sterilization program also served as a rehearsal for what was to come. It established the infrastructure, the health courts, the hospitals, the doctors trained to perform procedures on command, the bureaucrats accustomed to processing human lives like paperwork. It established the precedent that medicine could be used not for healing, but for social engineering. Once the principle was accepted, that the state could decide who should and shouldn't reproduce, it became easier to accept the next step, deciding who should and shouldn't live at all. It's important to see how the program blurred lines so carefully. Citizens were told it was humane, that it prevented the birth of children doomed to suffer. Doctors were told it was scientific, that it advanced knowledge and strengthened the population. Bureaucrats were told it was efficient, that it saved money and resources. Everyone could find a justification that fit their role, a reason to go along without feeling they were complicit in cruelty. That diffusion of responsibility was one of the program's most insidious features. By the late 1930s, sterilization had become normalized. The numbers climbed steadily, the procedures performed routinely. The files grew thicker, the charts more detailed. For the state, it was evidence that the program was working. For those affected, it was a lifetime scar. And all of it rested on the illusion that surgery could purify people, that cutting into flesh could shape a nation's future. And while scalpels cut and stitches closed, the regime was already imagining a broader application of the same logic. If sterilization was good for preventing unfit births, what about eliminating those already alive? The leap from surgery to killing was not as far as it might seem. The apparatus was ready, the professionals trained, the justification rehearsed. All that remained was to extend the definition of hygiene one step further. In most people's minds, a doctor is someone you trust when you're vulnerable. You go to them when you're sick, when you're in pain, when your body fails you. They're supposed to heal, to preserve life, to ease suffering. But in Nazi Germany, the medical profession became one of the most important pillars of the state's obsession with purity. The betrayal wasn't sudden. It crept in gradually, disguised as science, framed as duty, justified as progress. By the time the truth was undeniable, thousands of doctors had traded the oath to do no harm for the authority to decide who deserve to exist. From the moment sterilization laws were introduced, doctors were asked to participate. Some balked, at least at first. Cutting into a healthy body not to cure illness, but to prevent reproduction was not what they had been trained for. Yet many found ways to rationalize it. They told themselves it was prevention, not harm. They told themselves they were sparing future generations from suffering. They told themselves it was science, not cruelty. And for others, there was little hesitation at all. Ambitious young physicians saw it as an opportunity to align with the state, to prove their loyalty, to advance their careers. Hospitals became hubs of policy as much as places of care. Patients who thought they were entering for treatment sometimes found themselves under the scalpel for sterilization. Doctors filled out forms that categorized individuals as defective. Surgeons performed operations not for healing, but for social engineering. Nurses assisted, sometimes willingly, sometimes out of fear, but always part of the process. The white coat, the surgical mask, the sterile tools, they all gave an aura of legitimacy, even when the procedure itself was an assault against autonomy. Some doctors went further, embracing their new roles with enthusiasm. They published articles boasting about the number of sterilizations performed, presenting statistics as achievements. They attended conferences where techniques were discussed, complications compared, methods refined. It was a professional endeavour, stripped of the faces and names of the people who had endured it. Patients became cases, data points, examples of defective heredity. The distance created by clinical language allowed doctors to see themselves not as violators, but as scientists. But sterilization was only the beginning. By the late 1930s, whispers circulated about a new program, one that went beyond prevention. Hospitals began to quietly report on patients who were considered incurable, those with severe disabilities, those unable to care for themselves, those deemed to live lives unworthy of life. Questionnaires were sent out, asking doctors to mark patients with red crosses if they fit certain categories. Families often had no idea that the forms they signed at admission could seal a relative's fate. The program that emerged was known as Action T4, though the name was never used publicly. Doctors became the gatekeepers once again, deciding who lived and who died. Patients were transferred to special clinics, where they were told they would receive new treatments. Instead, they were led into rooms disguised as showers, where carbon monoxide was piped in. The killings were efficient, methodical, industrial. Death certificates were falsified, cause of death listed as pneumonia or heart failure. Families received polite letters of condolence, never told the truth of what had happened. The horror of T4 was that it wore the mask of medicine. Doctors signed the forms. Doctors examined the patients. Doctors declared them incurable, defective, burdensome. When the gas valves were turned, when the bodies were cremated, it was all framed as a medical procedure, a form of cleansing rather than murder. The involvement of the medical profession gave the entire program a sense of authority that no secret police or military unit could have achieved on their own. For the doctors who participated, the justification sounded disturbingly familiar. They spoke of mercy, of sparing families the burden of caring for the severely disabled, of freeing the state from costs that could be better spent elsewhere. They spoke of science, of cleansing the gene pool, of advancing human progress. Some even spoke of compassion, arguing that ending lives of suffering was kinder than prolonging them. But compassion wasn't what guided the program. It was ideology, wrapped in clinical language. The betrayal extended to children as well. Paediatric wards began to screen for disabilities, and infants born with deformities or illnesses were reported. Doctors encouraged parents to place such children in special care institutions where they would quietly be killed by starvation, injections, or neglect. Parents were often persuaded that this was for the best, that their child would suffer less. But the decision wasn't theirs to make. Once reported, the child was marked, and the outcome was inevitable. Not every doctor embraced this role. Some resisted quietly, falsifying diagnoses to protect patients, marking cases as curable when they were not. A few spoke out, risking careers and even lives. But they were rare exceptions. The majority went along, whether out of belief, ambition, fear, or resignation. And in doing so, they transformed the medical profession from a sanctuary into a weapon. The culture of medicine shifted as well. Medical students were taught not just anatomy and physiology, but racial hygiene. Textbooks included case studies of hereditary defectives, framing their sterilization or euthanasia as correct outcomes. Professors lectured about the duty of doctors to the state, not just to the individual. Healing became secondary to cleansing. The physician was no longer just a caretaker, but an agent of national health, responsible for pruning the population like a gardener trims diseased branches. The betrayal was so complete that by the time the war expanded, doctors were already prepared to take part in even more extreme measures. The skills honed in sterilizations and euthanasia programs transferred directly into the concentration camps. Physicians there decided who was fit for labour and who would go directly to the gas chambers. They conducted experiments on prisoners, often without anaesthesia, testing hypothermia, infection, chemical burns, and sterilization techniques. Once again, it was framed as science. Once again, the authority of the white coat cloaked cruelty in the language of progress. The role of doctors in this system was not a side note, it was central. Without them, the policies could not have functioned. Bureaucrats could stamp forms. Police could enforce orders. But only doctors could provide the veneer of legitimacy. Only doctors could declare someone defective, unfit, incurable. Only doctors could perform the procedures, sign the certificates, oversee the institutions. Their betrayal was not just in action, but in silence, in allowing their profession to be twisted without mass resistance. What made it even more insidious was how ordinary it looked from the outside. A hospital ward? A clinic? A doctor's office? They all looked like places of healing. The nurses wore clean uniforms. The halls smelled of disinfectant. The charts were neatly filled. Families brought relatives in for care, not knowing they were delivering them into danger. The cruelty didn't always look like cruelty. It looked like medicine, paperwork, procedure. That disguise made it harder to recognize, harder to resist, harder to believe. And once the line was crossed, there was no going back. When doctors accepted that sterilization was medicine, it was only a step to accepting that euthanasia was medicine. When they accepted that euthanasia was medicine, it was only a step to experiments. And when experiments were normalized, the final step was deciding, calmly and clinically, who lived and who died on a train platform at Auschwitz. The betrayal was not just individual, it was institutional. The very idea of medicine was corrupted, turned into its opposite. For those who lived through it, the realization must have been shattering. To sit across from a doctor, to hear them explain your condition, to believe you were in safe hands, only to find that they saw you not as a patient, but as a problem. A man who had trained for years to heal could, with the same steady hand, cut away your chance of a family or sign the form that ended your life. That inversion of trust, that transformation of healers into executioners, is one of the darkest legacies of the period. The hospitals where it happened still stood, their walls as solid as ever. The offices still had their files neatly stacked. The operating rooms still gleamed with instruments. Nothing about the physical space suggested cruelty. It was the people, the choices, the ideology that turned them from sanctuaries into slaughterhouses. And it was doctors, above all, who made that transition possible. If sterilization laws and euthanasia programs were the machinery, propaganda was the fuel. None of it would have worked without the public believing, or at least accepting, that it was justified. And for that, the regime didn't rely only on speeches or rallies. It relied on images, films, posters, pamphlets, and schoolbooks. An entire ecosystem of persuasion designed to make eugenics look like common sense. Propaganda became the science textbook of Nazi Germany, teaching people not only what to think, but how to see the world. The first thing to understand is how ordinary the messages looked. Posters didn't scream hatred in big black letters. Instead, they showed friendly illustrations, tidy charts, and clean lines. A poster might depict two families, one with a dozen healthy blonde children smiling around a table, the other with a disabled child and exhausted parents struggling to make ends meet. The caption would ask something like, "Which family is good for the nation?" The implication was clear, but the tone was calm, almost educational. It wasn't about hate, it was about arithmetic, about costs, efficiency, hygiene. That was one of the propaganda's greatest tricks. It didn't present itself as ideology. It presented itself as fact. A pamphlet might list how many Reichsmarks it costs to care for a mentally ill patient each year, compared to how much it costs to build a house or feed a family. The numbers were printed in bold, easy-to-read type, as though they had been lifted directly from an accountant's ledger. Citizens didn't feel like they were being manipulated. They felt like they were being informed. It was propaganda disguised as a math lesson. The language was careful too. Instead of talking about killing or sterilizing, the words were framed as protection and prevention. Protecting the gene pool. Preventing suffering. Relieving families of burdens. These phrases softened the reality, turning violence into hygiene, coercion into care. Even when posters showed disabled individuals as grotesque caricatures, the captions often claimed to speak out of compassion. Why bring more suffering into the world? Why condemn future generations? Why waste resources that could go to healthy children? The appeal wasn't only to fear or prejudice, it was to duty. Citizens were told they had a responsibility to support these measures for the greater good. Schools were saturated with the same messages. Biology classes included sections on hereditary diseases, illustrated with family trees marked with black dots to represent defects. Students were taught to trace these dots through generations to see how one defective ancestor could produce an entire branch of weakness. The exercises were simple, almost like puzzles, and they trained children to think of people as genetic diagrams rather than individuals. A student who once learned multiplication tables was now solving problems like, if one defective family costs the state 50,000 Reichsmarks in 20 years, How many healthy houses could be built with that money? It was math twisted into moral instruction. Films carried the same message into theatres. Erbkrank, Hereditary Defective, was one of the most notorious. It presented patients in psychiatric hospitals, their faces filmed without dignity, while a calm narrator explained how much they cost the state. The film ended by urging viewers to support sterilization, framing it as the humane solution. Audiences didn't always cheer, but they rarely protested. Watching these films was like watching a documentary. The voice of authority told you it was true, and repetition made it feel inevitable. Another film, Ich klage an, I accuse, dramatised euthanasia as an act of compassion. It told the story of a woman suffering from multiple sclerosis who begged her husband, a doctor, to end her life. In the film, he eventually did, and the act was presented not as murder, but as love. The message was obvious. Euthanasia wasn't cruelty, it was kindness. When audiences left the theatre, they had seen killing framed not as ideology, but as mercy. That was the genius of propaganda. It could make the unacceptable look humane. The messages didn't only come from official channels, they seeped into everyday life. Newspapers printed stories about families ruined by hereditary illness, always highlighting the costs, the burdens, the hopelessness. Magazines ran articles praising healthy Aryan families with many children, presenting them as the nation's ideal. Radio broadcasts repeated slogans about cleanliness, strength, and duty. Even church sermons sometimes echoed the same themes, speaking of purity and sacrifice, aligning spiritual language with racial hygiene. Ordinary citizens absorbed these messages gradually. Few people read a poster and immediately became fanatics, but over time the repetition worked. A mother might hesitate when her child's teacher suggested a medical examination, but after seeing posters, hearing radio broadcasts, and reading pamphlets, she began to believe it was normal. A man might feel uneasy about sterilization laws, but after watching a film that framed them as compassionate, he found himself nodding along. The propaganda didn't need to convince everyone fully. It just needed to normalize the conversation, to make people stop questioning, to create silence where resistance might have been. What made it so effective was the way it blurred the line between education and ideology. When a child saw a family tree diagram in school, they didn't think they were learning propaganda. They thought they were learning science. When a citizen read a newspaper article about the costs of care, they thought they were reading facts. When a film framed euthanasia as mercy, viewers thought they were watching a moral drama. The manipulation was subtle, woven into the ordinary rhythms of life. Imagine being a schoolboy in 1936, flipping through a biology textbook. On one page is a diagram of a frog's anatomy. On the next, a chart showing how degenerate traits are inherited. You copy both into your notebook, not distinguishing one from the other. Both are presented as science. Both carry the same authority. Years later, when you hear about a neighbour being sterilised, it feels consistent with what you learned as a child. The propaganda has done its work not by shouting, but by teaching. Even architecture and art carried the message. Public buildings were adorned with sculptures of muscular Aryan figures, perfect bodies carved in stone, symbolising the nation's health. Exhibitions displayed portraits of ideal families, reinforcing what normal and desirable looked like. At the same time, so-called degenerate art was banned, its creators ridiculed as examples of biological and cultural decay. The aesthetic reinforced the ideology. Beauty was health, strength was purity, deviation was contamination. The propaganda didn't always convince through argument. Sometimes it worked through fear. Posters warned about racial defilement, depicting interracial relationships as threats to the future. Films showed criminals and asocials as products of defective heredity, suggesting that anyone could harbour hidden contamination. Citizens were encouraged to report neighbours, co-workers, even family members who might be unfit. The propaganda created not just belief, but suspicion, weaving distrust into the social fabric. And yet, much of it still wore the mask of calm reason. That's what made it so insidious. Hatred shouted can sometimes be resisted, but hatred disguised as arithmetic, as hygiene, as compassion, those are harder to argue against. When a teacher explains that one defective family costs as much as 10 healthy ones, it sounds like logic. When a doctor tells you sterilization will prevent suffering, it sounds like care. When a film depicts euthanasia as love, it sounds like mercy. The propaganda didn't just spread lies, it reshaped language itself, turning cruelty into common sense. By the late 1930s, the results were clear. Public support for sterilization had grown, not because people were naturally cruel, but because they had been taught to see it as normal. Families reported relatives, teachers flagged students, neighbours whispered about one another. Silence was easier than resistance, and agreement was easier still. The propaganda had succeeded in convincing millions of people that what was happening wasn't horror. It was hygiene. It was science. It was right. And once the public had been conditioned to see sterilization and euthanasia as reasonable, the stage was set for the next escalation. If cleansing the gene pool was scientific, if eliminating the unfit was merciful, then what about extending those same principles to entire populations? What about applying racial hygiene not just to the disabled or the ill, but to Jews, Roma, and other groups deemed undesirable? The propaganda machine was ready. It had already trained people to see lives as data, costs, burdens. All it had to do was shift the target. If propaganda was the loudspeaker of the regime, schools were its echo chamber. Convincing adults through posters and films was one thing, but shaping the worldview of children ensured that the ideology wouldn't just be tolerated, it would be inherited. In the Germany of the 1930s, classrooms became laboratories of belief, where biology and arithmetic were rewritten to teach not just facts about the world, but judgments about who deserved to live in it. On the surface, school looked the same as it always had. Children still carried satchels, sharpened pencils, and sat at wooden desks in neat rows. Teachers still wrote on chalkboards, assigning sums and dictations. But woven into those everyday lessons was a new curriculum, one that presented racial hygiene not as an opinion, but as science. To be educated was to be indoctrinated, though the children themselves rarely noticed the difference. Biology classes carried much of the weight. Where a lesson on plants once described roots and stems, now it explained hereditary traits in humans. Textbooks printed diagrams of family trees with black dots marking defects. Blindness, epilepsy, feeble-mindedness, alcoholism, traced through generations to show how weakness spread. Students were asked to copy these diagrams into their notebooks, to draw lines and calculate probabilities. It was presented with the same precision as a math problem, heredity in, defect out. No discussion of environment, no allowance for chance, just a deterministic chart that made human worth look like a formula. Arithmetic lessons followed the same pattern. Children weren't just adding and subtracting apples anymore. They were calculating costs. It costs the state 60,000 Reichsmarks to care for a hereditarily ill person over their lifetime, one exercise might state. How many healthy families could be supported with that money? The children did the math, pencils scratching quietly across paper, not realizing that they were rehearsing the logic of exclusion. Each answer reinforced the idea that lives could be weighed against each other, that resources were best reserved for the fit. History lessons were rewritten as well. The narrative emphasized German strength, purity, and destiny, but it also highlighted supposed threats from within. Teachers spoke of past generations weakened by mixing with inferior blood, framing decline as the result of poor biological choices. The message was clear. The survival of the nation depended not just on military victories, but on careful breeding. National history became an argument for racial hygiene, written into the past to justify the present. Children's books carried the same message in softer tones. Stories featured strong, healthy Aryan families as heroes, while characters with disabilities or defects were depicted as pitiable or dangerous. Illustrations showed bright, smiling children with blonde hair and blue eyes contrasted against darker, sadder figures labelled as degenerate. Even bedtime stories became lessons, seeding ideas before children were old enough to question them. The teachers were central to it all. Some embraced the curriculum enthusiastically, convinced they were educating a new generation of strong Germans. Others may have had doubts, but the system left little room for dissent. Lesson plans were provided, textbooks mandated, inspections frequent. To refuse was to risk one's career, if not worse. And so day after day, teachers stood before their students and explained that some of their classmates were worth more than others. The cruelty was not always abstract. Classrooms sometimes turned into stages for demonstration. A teacher might ask students to point out who among them had traits of weakness, glasses, stammers, physical disabilities. A child might be brought to the front of the room, their differences highlighted as examples of hereditary defects. For the class, it was framed as a lesson in science. For the child, it was humiliation. A label that could follow them through school and beyond. The cruelty was not hidden. It was normalized, wrapped in the authority of education. Imagine being a 12-year-old in 1937, sitting in a classroom where the teacher explains that some children will grow up to strengthen the nation and others to weaken it. You glance around the room, wondering which category you fall into, whether your classmates are silently measuring your worth. You copy diagrams of skulls into your notebook, not knowing that in a few years the same diagrams will be used to decide who lives and who dies. You don't feel like you're being indoctrinated. You feel like you're learning. The Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls reinforced the lessons outside the classroom. These organisations weren't just about marching or sports. They carried the ideology of eugenics into leisure time. Boys were taught to value strength, health and obedience, preparing them to be future soldiers and fathers of fit families. Girls were taught about motherhood, purity, and the importance of bearing many healthy children. Camps included lectures on racial hygiene, games that reinforced the idea of Aryan superiority, songs that celebrated purity. It was indoctrination, woven into fun, so that the children absorbed it without resistance. The effect was powerful. A generation grew up internalizing the idea that worth could be measured in biology. For them, sterilization and euthanasia weren't shocking policies. They were consistent with what they had been taught all along. When they saw posters or heard speeches, it wasn't new information. It was reinforcement. The groundwork had been laid in the classroom, pencil strokes on paper preparing them for the reality outside. Parents sometimes resisted quietly, uneasy about what their children were learning. But the pressure was immense. To complain was to risk suspicion, to mark yourself as disloyal. And many parents, already surrounded by propaganda in newspapers and radio, began to accept the lessons as truth. Some even encouraged their children, proud when teachers praised them for understanding the importance of racial hygiene. Home and school echoed each other, closing the circle of belief. The cruelty of the curriculum lay in its subtlety. Children weren't told outright that certain classmates should be killed. They were told that some families cost too much, that some traits weakened the nation, that the future depended on strength. They solved math problems, drew family trees, sang songs. By the time the reality of sterilization and euthanasia became known, it didn't feel like a rupture. It felt like confirmation of what they had always been taught. Universities continued the education, carrying the same messages into adulthood. Medical students studied racial biology as if it were a legitimate field, learning to measure skulls, classify traits, and identify hereditary defects. Law students studied marriage laws and sterilization policies, trained to enforce them as future judges and bureaucrats. Even architecture students absorbed the ideology, designing buildings meant to embody Aryan strength and purity. Education at every level was suffused with eugenics, turning professions into extensions of ideology. The result was a society where questioning felt impossible. When children learned eugenics in school, when parents read it in newspapers, when doctors confirmed it in clinics, when professors taught it in universities, the ideology surrounded them from every direction. It didn't feel like propaganda anymore. It felt like reality. And yet, within the classrooms and textbooks, something more insidious was happening. The distinction between facts and values was being erased. Children learned that heredity worked like math, but they also learned that math could determine morality. They learned that biology determined destiny, but they also learned that destiny justified exclusion. Once those lines blurred, it became easy to move from diagrams on a page to policies in real life. By the late 1930s, a child who had started school under the Nazi regime had known nothing else. For them, the categories of fit and unfit, healthy and defective, were not strange or controversial. They were part of the world, like the alphabet or multiplication tables. When they grew into teenagers and young adults, they carried those lessons with them into the Hitler Youth, into universities, into the military. The indoctrination was complete not because it shouted loudly, but because it whispered quietly every day, until it became the background noise of life. And as that generation came of age, the regime was ready to act on the lessons they had absorbed. Sterilization and euthanasia had already been normalized. The next step was to apply the same logic not just to individuals with disabilities, but to entire populations. The children who once solved math problems about costs and heredity would soon be adults carrying rifles, working in offices, or wearing lab coats. And when the state told them who deserved to live, many would see it not as horror, but as the logical conclusion of everything they had been taught. By the late 1930s, sterilization had become routine, and propaganda had done its work. People were accustomed to thinking of lives in terms of costs, burdens, and defects. But for the regime, surgery was not enough. Sterilization prevented future generations, but it left the present intact. There were still tens of thousands of people living in hospitals, asylums, and institutions. Individuals the state had already labelled as incurable or unfit. They required food, housing, and care. They were, in the cold arithmetic of the Nazi state, liabilities. And so, sterilization quietly gave way to something more final: killing. The program was never announced openly. There were no posters shouting slogans, no public decrees broadcast on the radio. Instead, it was organised in secret, its operations disguised as medicine, its paperwork wrapped in euphemism. The address that gave the program its name was innocuous: Tiergartenstrasse 4, a villa in Berlin where the offices of the program were housed. From there, files were managed, orders signed, transport scheduled. It was bureaucracy as much as it was murder, and that made it easier to hide, easier to justify, easier to carry out. The process began with questionnaires. Hospitals and institutions were required to fill them out for their patients, listing diagnoses, abilities, and costs. Doctors marked boxes, sometimes with care, sometimes with haste, often without realising, or pretending not to realise, that their marks were effectively death sentences. A red cross scrawled in the corner of a page meant the patient was selected. The forms were sent to the T4 office, where panels of doctors reviewed them quickly, sometimes spending only seconds on each file. The decision to live or die could be made without ever seeing the person in question, without hearing their voice, without knowing their story. Once selected, patients were transferred to one of several special institutions: Grafeneck, Brandenburg, Wartime, Sonnenstein, Bernburg, Hadamar. Each had been retrofitted for a new purpose. Rooms were disguised as showers, fitted with sealed doors and carbon monoxide pipes. Crematoria were built nearby, their chimneys soon to become grim landmarks for local communities. The architecture of care had been transformed into the architecture of killing. The transfers themselves were shrouded in deception. Families were told their relatives were being moved for better treatment, for new therapies, for improved facilities. Patients boarded buses with windows painted over, so no one could see who was inside. The buses became a familiar sight in towns near the killing centres, and residents whispered about their purpose. But officially, the transfers were routine. The letters families received afterward were carefully worded, expressing sympathy and regret. The cause of death was usually listed as pneumonia, tuberculosis, or heart failure. Sometimes ashes were sent in urns, accompanied by a note of condolence. The deception was meticulous, designed to keep the killing quiet, to prevent unrest, to preserve the illusion of medicine. Inside the killing centres, the process was coldly efficient. Patients arrived, were registered, photographed, and examined. The photographs were often used for teaching purposes, displayed in lectures as examples of defective heredity. Afterward, the patients were led into the gas chambers. Carbon monoxide cylinders hissed, the doors sealed, the rooms silent within minutes. The bodies were cremated, the ashes often mixed together and distributed at random to families. It was industrial killing, organised with the same attention to paperwork as any other state function. Doctors and nurses were central to the process. They examined patients, selected them, supervised the killings, falsified death certificates. Their involvement gave the program its disguise as medicine. A doctor's signature on a form made it seem official, rational, even compassionate. But the reality was murder on a mass scale. Between 1939 and 1941, around 70,000 people were killed under the T4 program. The killings were justified with the same language citizens had been hearing for years. Patients were described as incurable, as burdens, as lives unworthy of life. Officials spoke of mercy, of preventing suffering, of protecting families from endless care. They spoke of efficiency, of saving resources for healthy citizens, of strengthening the nation. Every justification was wrapped in the language of hygiene, compassion and science. Few admitted that what was happening was simple, deliberate killing. The public was not entirely unaware. The buses were seen. The chimneys of crematoria smoked day and night. Families compared notes, realizing that many of their relatives had died suddenly, often within weeks of being transferred. Whispers spread. Priests spoke cautiously in sermons. Some citizens wrote letters of protest, asking why so many patients were dying of the same supposed illnesses. The deception could not entirely hide the truth. One of the most notable voices of protest came from Bishop Clement August von Galen, who denounced the killings in a sermon in 1941. His words carried weight, and the regime took notice. By that time, rumours and discontent had grown enough that the Nazis decided to officially halt the T4 program, at least on paper. The killings in the main centre stopped. Yet the offices on Tiergartenstrasse 4 were closed, but the machinery did not vanish. It simply shifted into new forms. Decentralised killing continued in hospitals and institutions across Germany. Patients were starved, overdosed, or neglected. Doctors and nurses carried on quietly without centralised orders, but with the same underlying logic. Children born with disabilities were targeted, their deaths explained as medical necessity. The numbers kept climbing, even if the program no longer carried the T4 name. The significance of T4 lay not only in its immediate victims, but in what it prepared. It established the methods, gas chambers, crematoria, deception, paperwork, that would later be expanded in the Holocaust. The infrastructure of industrial killing was tested on the disabled before it was applied to Jews, Roma, and others. The doctors and bureaucrats who had learned to falsify certificates, to organise transports, to supervise gas chambers, carried those skills into the camps of occupied Europe. T4 was the rehearsal, and its legacy was Auschwitz. For the families left behind, the loss was compounded by silence. Many knew deep down that their relatives hadn't died of pneumonia or heart failure. But to speak out was dangerous. To accuse the state of murder was to risk being marked as disloyal. So grief was carried quietly, sometimes for decades, hidden beneath the weight of official lies. The deception outlived the program itself, leaving survivors uncertain, ashamed, and often alone. The cruelty of T4 was not just in the deaths, but in the betrayal of medicine. Hospitals, once places of healing, became killing centres. Doctors, once trusted, became executioners. The white coat became a mask for violence, and because it was framed as science, many citizens accepted it, or at least did not resist it loudly. That was the most chilling success of the programme. It made killing look like medicine. By the time the war spread across Europe, the lessons of T4 were embedded in the machinery of the state. Killing had been bureaucratised, medicalised, normalised. The step from sterilising to killing, from hospitals to camps, had already been taken. All that remained was to expand the scale, to widen the definition of unfit, to apply the logic of hygiene to entire peoples. The gas chambers were ready, the The files were ready, the doctors were ready. If the doctors provided the signatures and the surgeons carried out the procedures, the real engine of Nazi eugenics was paper. Not scalpels, not syringes, not gas valves, but paperwork. Behind the killings and the sterilizations was an ocean of files, forms, stamps and ledgers. It was bureaucracy that turned ideology into daily routine, that reduced individuals to lines on a page, that made life and death decisions look like administrative tidiness. Picture a government office in Berlin in 1939. The desks are lined up in neat rows. Clerks sit with pens scratching across paper. Typewriters clacking rhythmically. Rubber stamps slamming down with steady thuds. To anyone passing by, it could be the Ministry of Finance or Agriculture. But here, the files being processed are not budgets or harvest yields. They are patient questionnaires, marriage applications, ancestry charts. Each document represents a life, and the way it is filed or stamped will decide its trajectory. The bureaucrats themselves were rarely dramatic figures. They weren't the ones performing surgeries or opening gas valves. They were middle-aged clerks in spectacles, civil servants trained to process forms efficiently. Many of them had been working in government offices long before the Nazis came to power, accustomed to paperwork as the fabric of their profession. For them, it was just more files, more stamps, more paperwork. The ideology behind it mattered less than the mechanics of doing their job well, yet the consequences of those files were devastating. A questionnaire marked with a red cross could send someone to a sterilization ward. A denied marriage license could end a family line. A transport order could move patients from one institution to a killing centre. All of these decisions flowed through offices staffed with clerks, typists and archivists, each playing their small part in the machinery. The genius of the system, if one can call it that, was how it dispersed responsibility. No single bureaucrat felt they were making life and death decisions. One clerk typed up the form, another filed it, another stamped it, another passed it along to the next desk. Each action was small, technical, seemingly harmless. But together, they created a process that sorted, sterilized, and killed. The violence was hidden behind the calm rhythm of administration. The files themselves carried a peculiar weight. Each contained personal details, names, dates of birth, family histories, medical diagnoses. Photographs were often attached, staring out from the folders with frozen expressions. But once inside the file, the person became abstract. They were not Anna or Carl anymore. They were Case, just 4 wound Bevan 2, marked epileptic, hereditary burden. The reduction of a human life to a file number made it easier to process, easier to forget the reality behind the paperwork. Marriage applications provide one example. Couples seeking to wed had to submit ancestry certificates, tracing their lineage back generations. Clerks examined baptismal records, birth certificates, family trees. If the documents were complete and the ancestry pure, the file was stamped approved. If not, it was rejected, and the couple's future ended with a flick of the wrist. To the bureaucrat, it was routine. Check, stamp, file. To the couple, it was everything. The same was true of the questionnaires used in the T4 program. Hospital staff filled them out, often with minimal information. They were sent to offices where panels of doctors and clerks reviewed them quickly. Files with red crosses were separated from those without. The clerks then prepared transport orders, typed up lists of names, scheduled buses. Each step required paperwork. Each paper passed through multiple hands. And at the end of the process, a bus rolled into an institution courtyard. Patients were loaded inside, and the file was closed. The paperwork extended to death itself. After killings in the T4 centres, families received letters with falsified causes of death. Clerks typed them up carefully, often reusing standard templates. The tone was polite, formal, even sympathetic. We regret to inform you. The bureaucrat at the typewriter was not thinking about the body cremated that morning. They were thinking about margins, formatting, signatures. Death became a form letter. The sheer volume of files was staggering. Cabinets filled with them, drawers packed tight, stacks of folders towering on desks. Each represented a decision about reproduction, sterilization, or life itself. The paperwork was not incidental. It was the system. It allowed killing to be industrialized, depersonalized, scaled up. Without it, the machinery would have faltered. With it, everything moved smoothly, efficiently, invisibly. For the bureaucrats themselves, it was easy to feel detached. Many didn't see the outcomes directly. They only saw the paper trail. A clerk typing up transport orders might never visit a killing centre. A typist sending condolence letters might never see a crematorium. The distance insulated them from the reality of their work. They could tell themselves they were simply doing their jobs, following procedures, obeying the chain of command. Responsibility was always elsewhere, further up the hierarchy. Yet their signatures mattered. A stamp could condemn. A misplaced form could save. There were cases where clerks, intentionally or not, delayed paperwork, misplaced files, or marked them incorrectly, sparing individuals temporarily or permanently. These were rare, but they reveal how much power was hidden in the paperwork. Even a single stroke of a pen could alter a life. The bureaucracy also created an illusion of legality. Because every step was documented, every order signed, every decision filed, the process looked legitimate. It wasn't chaos or mob violence. It was procedure. Citizens who asked questions were shown documents with official seals. Doctors who protested were told the orders had been approved by health courts. Families who complained received letters with signatures and stamps. The paperwork gave the appearance of order, masking the reality of mass killing. Imagine sitting at a desk in one of those offices, flipping through files as the stack grows higher. The rhythm of stamping and filing becomes mechanical, hypnotic. You don't think about the people behind the names. You think about finishing your quota before lunch, about keeping your supervisor satisfied, about making sure your forms are neat and error-free. Around you, other clerks do the same, each absorbed in the minutiae of their tasks. The office hums with quiet efficiency, and outside, buses roll toward their destinations. The chilling part is how ordinary it looked. The offices were not sinister places. They were clean, organised, professional. Typewriters clicked, phones rang, clerks chatted softly. Visitors might not guess that the files on the desks represented lives being ended. The violence was hidden in plain sight, disguised as administration. This was not unique to the T4 programme. Bureaucracy was central to every aspect of Nazi eugenics. Sterilization laws required endless forms and approvals. Marriage restrictions needed registries and certificates. Ancestry investigations demanded meticulous record-keeping. The Holocaust itself would later rely on the same bureaucratic infrastructure. Transport lists, camp records, deportation orders. Paperwork was the skeleton of the entire system. What makes the role of bureaucrats so unsettling is that they weren't fanatics or ideologues, at least not all of them. Many were ordinary civil servants, trained to value efficiency, order, and procedure. They didn't chant slogans or give fiery speeches. They filed, they typed, they stamped, and in doing so, they made ideology into reality. The banality of their work was its most frightening feature. By the time the war expanded, the bureaucratic machine was fully entrenched. Files moved seamlessly from local offices to central ministries. Orders flowed down the chain, reports flowed back up. Everything was recorded, everything documented. It gave the appearance of control, of rationality, of inevitability, and as long as the forms kept moving, the killing kept going. The role of bureaucrats reminds us that mass violence does not always come from the barrel of a gun. Sometimes it comes from the tip of a pen, the slam of a stamp, the shuffle of papers across a desk. The clerk in the office may never see the victim, but their decision seals the victim's fate. In Nazi Germany, the paper trail was as deadly as any weapon, and behind those files, waiting to be acted upon, were the patients themselves. Men and women in psychiatric wards, children in hospitals, prisoners in camps, reduced to categories and numbers by a system that valued paperwork over humanity. In the tall, grey buildings of psychiatric hospitals, far from the noise of rallies and the spectacle of posters, another transformation was taking place. These institutions had once been places where the sick and troubled were meant to find care, however limited that care might have been. By the 1930s and 1940s, however, they became laboratories for ideology. Psychiatry, a field that was supposed to understand the human mind and ease suffering, was turned inside out. Its wards were filled with patients who were no longer seen as individuals, but as examples, case studies, and eventually expendable bodies for experimentation. The shift began with classification. Psychiatrists, like other doctors, were asked to fill out forms marking patients as hereditarily ill, incurable, or unfit. These designations, once made, followed patients everywhere. A man with depression could be stamped as defective. A woman with epilepsy might be written down as a danger to the gene pool. Schizophrenia, a diagnosis already poorly understood, became one of the most common justifications for sterilization. The line between medical observation and state policy disappeared, and psychiatrists found themselves acting less like healers and more like clerks for the regime. But psychiatry didn't stop at paperwork. The wards themselves became sites of experiment, though not in the sense of controlled scientific study. These were not experiments designed to test new therapies or uncover treatments. They were experiments in cruelty, in ideology disguised as research. Patients were subjected to procedures with little concern for their well-being. Doctors injected them with chemicals to see how their bodies would react. They withheld food to measure the effects of starvation. They exposed patients to cold or heat, not to help them, but to document the toll. The results were written in notebooks, the patients reduced to data points, their suffering repurposed as evidence. Imagine lying in a hospital bed in 1940, believing you are there for treatment. A doctor enters, surrounded by assistants, and tells you they're going to try a new method. You're not asked for consent. You are not given an explanation. You're simply told to comply. A needle pierces your arm, or a pill is forced into your mouth, and you wait as the nausea, dizziness, or pain sets in. The doctor watches calmly, taking notes. To them, you are not a person in distress. You are a test subject. Electroshock therapy, already controversial in its early use, was applied with little restraint. Patients were strapped down and jolted repeatedly, sometimes to test dosage, sometimes to break their resistance, sometimes simply because the procedure fit the ideology of purging weakness. Insulin coma therapy, another brutal treatment of the era, was pushed far beyond therapeutic bounds. Patients forced into seizures and comas as doctors recorded their reactions. These methods were not aimed at healing, but at gathering information, or at least the appearance of information, that could be used to support the narrative of incurability. The very architecture of psychiatric wards lent itself to control. Locked rooms, barred windows, rigid routines, all made patients easy to manage, easy to isolate, easy to conceal from the outside world. Families who brought loved ones to institutions often did not know what happened behind those walls. They trusted the doctors, the nurses, the administrators. They believed their relatives were being cared for. Instead, many were being observed like specimens in cages, their humanity stripped away. Children were not spared. Pediatric psychiatric wards became sites of targeted killing and experimentation. Infants born with disabilities or illnesses were placed under the supervision of doctors who had no intention of helping them. Some were subjected to nutritional experiments, deliberately underfed to measure decline. Others were injected with substances to test their effects. The deaths of these children were written off as natural consequences of their conditions, their short lives used to justify further research. Parents were told their children had died peacefully of pneumonia or failure to thrive, never told about the experiments carried out on their bodies. The language of psychiatry provided cover. Case notes described patients as incurable, hopeless, burdensome. Reports framed starvation as a natural experiment in biology. When patients died, the deaths were recorded clinically, their suffering flattened into statistics. For doctors steeped in this language, it became easier to rationalize what they were doing. They weren't torturing or neglecting. They were documenting. They weren't complicit in murder. They were conducting research. Words made the reality bearable, at least for those who wanted to believe it. Some psychiatrists published their findings in journals, presenting data drawn from these so-called experiments. They argued that their work advanced understanding of hereditary illnesses, that their studies confirmed the degeneracy of certain conditions, that their results proved the need for sterilization or euthanasia. These articles gave the veneer of legitimacy to practices that were, at their core, acts of violence. Other doctors cited them in lectures, spreading the ideology further until the entire field was tainted by its association with eugenics. The involvement of psychiatry in killing was direct. Psychiatrists were often the ones who signed off on the questionnaires that selected patients for the T4 program. They examined individuals, declared them incurable, and recommended their transfer. They supervised the process of sedation and starvation in hospitals after T4 was officially shut down. They instructed nurses to administer overdoses of barbiturates, disguising deliberate killing as treatment. Their role was not incidental, it was central. Imagine being a nurse in one of those wards. You are told by your supervisor, a respected psychiatrist, that a patient must be given a stronger dose, that it is for their comfort, that it is necessary. You administer the injection, perhaps knowing, perhaps pretending not to know, that the dose will be lethal. The doctor signs the death certificate. The family is notified with a carefully worded letter, and the ward continues as if nothing has happened. This was how psychiatry was twisted, through authority, routine, and the steady erosion of the line between care and killing. Not all psychiatrists complied. Some resisted quietly, writing false diagnoses to protect patients, hiding individuals in remote wards, delaying paperwork. A few spoke out openly, risking arrest or worse. But they were exceptions, isolated and often powerless against the system. The majority went along, whether out of belief, ambition, fear, or resignation. And their compliance was enough to turn hospitals into laboratories of eugenics. The patients themselves left few records. Their voices were silenced, their lives erased. But scattered letters and diaries reveal glimpses of their experience, the confusion of being moved from one ward to another, the fear of injections, the hunger from reduced rations, the despair of realizing they had become subjects rather than patients. For them, the hospital was not a sanctuary. It was a prison, a laboratory, and too often a death sentence. The corruption of psychiatry had consequences far beyond the wards. It established a precedent that suffering bodies could be used as raw material, that medical ethics could be suspended in the name of science, that vulnerable people could be exploited without consent. These precedents carried directly into the concentration camps, where psychiatrists and other doctors supervised experiments on prisoners. Hypothermia, high altitude exposure, chemical burns, mass sterilization. The line between psychiatric wards and camp laboratories was thinner than it seemed. By the early 1940s, psychiatry in Nazi Germany was no longer about healing. It was about control, classification, and justification. Patients were not treated. They were processed. Their deaths were not tragedies. They were data points. Their lives were not valued. They were expendable in the pursuit of a myth that society could be purified through science. The wards stood quiet, their windows barred, their corridors echoing with footsteps. Nurses carried trays of medication. Doctors made rounds, clipboards in hand. To an outsider, it might have looked like any hospital. But behind the notes, behind the charts, behind the clinical language, the patients were being turned into something else, evidence for an ideology that had already decided their worth. And once psychiatry accepted that role, once patients became experiments, there was little left of restraining the medical profession from going further. The leap from wards to camps, from sedatives to gas, from case notes to mass extermination, was no longer unthinkable. It was the next logical step in a system that had already erased the line between medicine and murder. When the doors of the psychiatric wards closed behind patients in Germany, the logic of experimentation did not end there. It followed the doctors and scientists into the camps. The techniques refined in asylums and hospitals, the habits of classifying, observing, and testing on vulnerable people expanded into something larger, more systematic, and infinitely more brutal. The concentration camps became laboratories, not for curing disease or improving health, but for proving ideology, for serving military ambitions, and for satisfying the curiosity of doctors who had abandoned medicine for cruelty. On the surface, the camps were designed for imprisonment and extermination. Rows of barbed wire, watchtowers and barracks made clear that these were not hospitals. But within those walls, medicine operated in a twisted form. Doctors wore white coats, carried clipboards, and spoke in clinical tones. But their patients were not patients at all. They were prisoners, stripped of names, reduced to tattooed numbers, and treated as raw material for science as torture. The experiments varied in purpose. Some were aimed at supporting the war effort, testing the limits of the human body in extreme conditions. Others were driven by the ideology of racial hygiene, designed to prove that Jews, Roma, and other groups were biologically inferior. Still others were acts of cruelty disguised as curiosity, procedures performed simply because the prisoners were available, helpless, and dehumanized. Each experiment was recorded, documented, filed, as though it were part of legitimate research. But none of it was about healing. It was about control, ideology, and death. One of the most infamous sets of experiments involved freezing. At Dachau, prisoners were forced into ice-cold water or left outside in freezing weather, stripped of clothing, their bodies exposed to the elements. Doctors stood nearby with stopwatches, recording how long it took for shivering to begin, for consciousness to fade, for the heart to stop. Sometimes attempts were made to revive the prisoners, testing different methods: hot baths, body-to-body warmth, heated lamps. The goal was to find ways for German pilots shot down into icy seas to survive longer. The reality was dozens of men tortured to death in the name of military science. Their bodies were observed clinically. Their suffering turned into data. Other experiments pushed prisoners into extreme heat. At Dachau, some were locked into chambers where temperatures soared, their bodies watched as dehydration and organ failure set in. Others were placed in high-altitude chambers, simulating conditions pilots might encounter. They were strapped in as air was pumped out, their lungs straining, their blood vessels bursting. Some died with foam on their lips, their bodies convulsing, while doctors calmly took notes. Medical curiosity also turned toward disease. Prisoners were deliberately infected with malaria at Dachau, typhus at Buchenwald, tuberculosis at Neuengamme. Doctors injected pathogens into veins, rubbed them into cuts, or released infected lice into barracks. Victims were then observed as fevers rose, as skin broke out in lesions, as bodies wasted away. Different treatments were tested: quinine, vaccines, experimental drugs. But often the doses were deliberately too low, or the methods deliberately cruel. The goal was not really to save the prisoner, but to see how long they could endure, and whether German soldiers might benefit from the results. At Ravensbrück, women were used for surgical experiments. Their legs were cut open, deliberately infected with dirt, glass, or bacteria to mimic battlefield wounds. Doctors then tested different treatments, sometimes amputating, sometimes sewing, sometimes leaving the wounds to fester. The women, known as the rabbits, because they were forced to hop around on their injured legs, bore scars that made walking nearly impossible. Many were executed afterward to conceal the evidence. Those who survived carried the mutilations for life, physical reminders of how medicine had been perverted into torture. Sterilization, too, was tested in the camps. At Auschwitz, prisoners were exposed to radiation directed at their reproductive organs, doses calculated to destroy fertility. Women were injected with caustic substances into their uteruses, often leaving them in agony before rendering them infertile. Men were subjected to surgery without anesthesia, their testicles removed or mutilated. The experiments were presented as research into efficient sterilization methods for populations deemed undesirable, but in reality they were acts of violence performed under the cover of science. Children were not spared. Josef Mengele, the camp doctor at Auschwitz, became notorious for his fascination with twins. He saw them as opportunities for natural experiments, comparing one twin subjected to procedures against the other who was left untouched, or subjected to different forms of torture. He measured skulls, injected dyes into eyes to test for colour changes, performed surgeries without anaesthesia, and when one twin died, the other was often killed so that their organs could be compared. To Mengele, they were specimens. To the children, they were horrors beyond comprehension. What makes these experiments particularly chilling is how ordinary they looked in practice. Doctors kept charts, nurses carried trays, assistants wrote notes. The procedures were recorded in tidy handwriting with clinical detail. Subject convulsed at 14 minutes. Temperature dropped to 26 degrees. Subject expired at 1:42 p.m. The violence was hidden beneath professional language. The torture turned into data points. The authority of science cloaked the reality of murder. Prisoners themselves often knew what was coming. Word spread quickly through the barracks about who had been taken to the infirmary and never returned, about which names had been called during roll call only to vanish. Fear of being selected for experiments became a constant shadow. Some tried to hide signs of illness to avoid being noticed. Others volunteered, hoping to gain slightly better conditions or food, not realizing the price would be their lives. In a world where survival hinged on chance, even the false hope of an experiment seemed better than nothing. For the doctors, the camps were opportunities. They had access to subjects without consent, without restrictions, without accountability. They could test methods that would never have been allowed outside the camps. They could publish results in medical journals, present them at conferences, or use them to gain prestige. Some truly believed they were advancing science. Others cared only for career advancement, the chance to stand out in a regime that valued loyalty and results. Still others simply embraced cruelty, reveling in the power to harm. The irony is that much of the so-called research was scientifically useless. The conditions were uncontrolled, the method sloppy, the results unreliable. Data from freezing experiments, for example, was inconsistent and often contradictory. Sterilization techniques were brutal but inefficient. Disease experiments rarely produced treatments. The point was never real science. The point was power, ideology, and the dehumanization of prisoners. Yet the doctors insisted it was research, recording everything as though it mattered. The cruelty was compounded by the way medicine was used as a disguise. A prisoner taken to the infirmary might tell themselves they were going to be treated. The sight of a doctor in a white coat, the presence of medical instruments, the sterile smell of disinfectant, these were symbols of care. But in the camps, they became symbols of danger. A doctor's call could mean infection, mutilation, or death. The inversion of trust was total. Imagine being in Auschwitz in 1943, standing in line for roll call. A doctor points to you, instructing guards to take you away. You walk to the infirmary, your heart pounding, not knowing whether you will return. You sit on a cot while a nurse prepares instruments. A man in a white coat explains little or nothing. The procedure begins. The pain is sharp, the fear overwhelming. Notes are taken, measurements recorded, and when it's over, if you survive, you're left scarred, sterile, or dying. The next day, the charts are filed away, your suffering turned into data. The involvement of nurses and assistants cannot be overlooked. They carried out injections, restrained prisoners, cleaned wounds deliberately infected. Some did so reluctantly, others eagerly. Like bureaucrats with paperwork, they told themselves they were following orders, that responsibility lay higher up, but their hands were on the syringes, their presence made the experiments possible. The betrayal of trust extended far beyond the doctors themselves. By the time the war reached its peak, camp experiments had become a regular part of life and death in the system. Reports circulated up the chain, results presented as if they were legitimate science. The ideology of eugenics had found its most brutal expression. No longer content with charts, measurements, or sterilizations, the regime had turned entire camps into living laboratories of suffering. And, as these experiments continued, the line between research and extermination blurred completely. A prisoner too weak to endure an experiment could be sent directly to the gas chambers. A twin who died in one test could be dissected in another. A subject who survived an infection might be executed to make way for the next. Science and killing became indistinguishable, two faces of the same ideology. For all the charts, files and experiments, one of the central battlegrounds of Nazi eugenics was the female body. Women were placed at the heart of the project, celebrated when they bore the children the state wanted, and punished when they carried the wrong bloodlines or traits. The regime's obsession with birth and motherhood was not just ideology, it was policy, enforced through laws, propaganda, and coercion. Every pregnancy was political, every marriage a matter of state interest, every womb a potential tool for shaping the future. From the earliest days of Nazi rule, the image of the ideal woman was everywhere. Posters showed blonde mothers surrounded by healthy children, smiling beneath slogans about duty and sacrifice. Medals were awarded to women who had large families. The Mother's Cross, given in bronze, silver, or gold depending on the number of children. Bronze for 4, silver for 6, gold for 8 or more. It was framed as an honour, a national service, as though raising children was equal to fighting on the front lines. Ceremonies were held, speeches delivered, photographs taken. A woman's fertility was transformed into propaganda. At the same time, women deemed unfit were denied the right to motherhood. Sterilization laws targeted them ruthlessly. If a woman had epilepsy, depression, or any diagnosis the state considered hereditary, she could be summoned to a health court and ordered to undergo sterilization. The procedure was invasive, permanent, and often performed without consent. Some women woke from surgery to discover that their wombs had been sealed, their ability to bear children taken from them forever. For them, motherhood was not an honour, but a right stripped away, a future erased. Marriage itself became subject to eugenics. Couples were required to obtain certificates proving they were free of hereditary disease. Doctors examined them. Officials scrutinised their ancestry. Bureaucrats stamped or rejected their applications. If a woman was found unfit, the marriage could be forbidden. Love was irrelevant. The state had the final word. Even if a certificate was granted, it came with the weight of surveillance. Women knew that their reproductive lives were not private. They were matters of national concern. The contradictions of Nazi policy toward women were striking. On one hand, the regime encouraged traditional roles: wives, mothers, homemakers. Women were praised for their fertility, their nurturing, their role in building the nation through children. On the other hand, women were reduced to their biology, valued only if they could produce the right kind of offspring. An ideal mother was not celebrated for her individuality or character. She was celebrated for her womb, her bloodline, her ability to bring forth children who fit the racial ideal. Even intimacy was regulated. The regime passed laws forbidding relationships between Aryan women and men considered racially inferior, particularly Jews and Roma. These laws, called the Nuremberg Laws, criminalized love itself if it crossed racial boundaries. Women who engaged in such relationships could be shamed, punished, or imprisoned. Propaganda painted them as traitors. Posters showing blonde women in the arms of dark, caricatured men with captions warning of racial defilement. Women's bodies were framed as borders, their sexuality policed as a matter of national security. Pregnancy carried its own dangers. For women labelled unfit, a pregnancy could trigger sterilization or worse. Some were forced into abortions by doctors who insisted it was necessary to prevent defective births. Others were sterilized immediately after giving birth, their ability to have more children cut off without warning. The same hospitals that celebrated fertile Aryan mothers subjected other women to operating tables, their reproductive futures decided not by choice, but by decree. For women in occupied territories, the situation was even more brutal. Polish and Soviet women, deemed racially inferior, were often sterilized or forced into abortions. At the same time, children born to Aryan-looking parents in those regions were sometimes taken away, kidnapped and placed in German families to be raised as part of the racial community. Women lost not only their fertility but their children, stolen in the name of eugenics. Motherhood, once exalted, became a privilege reserved only for those the regime considered worthy. Inside the camps, the ideology was carried out with even harsher cruelty. Women were subjected to sterilization experiments, radiation, chemicals, surgeries performed without anesthesia. Pregnant women arriving at camps were often sent directly to the gas chambers, their unborn children deemed unworthy of life. Others were forced to give birth only to see their infants killed immediately after delivery. In some camps, women were used in experiments on fertility, their bodies treated as disposable instruments for testing methods of mass sterilization. Yet, even in the camps, the contradictions persisted. SS officers sometimes encouraged relationships between Aryan prisoners or between Germans and selected women, believing that desirable traits could be bred. Brothels were established in some camps, staffed by female prisoners chosen and coerced into service. The regime's obsession with controlling women's sexuality reached into every corner, twisting motherhood, love, and intimacy into instruments of ideology. Propaganda made sure these policies were accepted, even celebrated. Magazines featured articles on ideal Aryan mothers, complete with photographs of tidy homes, healthy children, and proud husbands. Pamphlets explained how women's duty was to bear children, to nurture the future, to avoid defiling themselves with unsuitable partners. Radio broadcasts praised large families, linking fertility with patriotism. The message was constant. A woman's body was not her own. It belonged to the nation. Imagine being a young woman in Germany in the mid-1930s. You attend school, where teachers explain the importance of racial hygiene. You see posters urging you to have many children. You hear radio broadcasts praising motherhood. You know that when you marry, your ancestry will be examined, your fitness evaluated. You know that if you bear children, they will be celebrated if they are healthy and Aryan, but condemned if they carry traits the state considers defective. Every decision, from whom you love to whether you have children, feel shadowed by the regime's gaze. For women labelled unfit, the experience was devastating. Letters and diaries tell of women who longed for children but were denied by sterilization. Some describe the humiliation of being examined, questioned, and declared defective. Others wrote of waking from surgery in confusion, realizing only gradually that their fertility was gone. These women carried the loss quietly, often in shame, unable to speak openly about what had been done to them. The obsession with motherhood also had consequences for women who did have many children. Though celebrated, they were also pressured, their worth tied entirely to their fertility. Some wrote about exhaustion, about the burden of constant pregnancies, about being praised in public but struggling in private. The medals, the ceremonies, the propaganda made it seem glamorous, but the reality was often hardship, poverty, and endless labour. Their lives were not valued for themselves, but for the children they produced. The control of women's bodies was not limited to reproduction. Education, employment, and daily life were shaped by ideology. Women were discouraged from higher education or professional careers, told their place was in the home. Yet they were also expected to be strong, healthy, and ready to bear children. They were urged to exercise, to avoid smoking or drinking, to maintain purity of body and blood. Their bodies were monitored not only for defects, but for health, as though the future of the nation could be read in their posture, their weight, their complexion. In this way, eugenics seeped into every corner of women's lives. Marriage was not private. Pregnancy was not personal. Motherhood was not individual. All were matters of state policy, enforced with laws, surgeries, propaganda, and fear. Women were praised, punished, celebrated, and sterilized, all depending on how closely they fit the racial ideal. By the early 1940s, these policies had created a strange dual reality. On one side, smiling mothers with medals, praised in magazines and parades. On the other, silent women in hospitals, sterilized against their will, their futures erased. Both realities were the product of the same ideology, the same obsession with controlling birth, marriage, and motherhood. And as the war dragged on, the control only deepened. Shortages, evacuations, bombings, all of it was layered on top of the constant pressure to reproduce or to accept sterilization. Women lived lives shaped by ideology, their bodies turned into battlegrounds, their choices stripped away. And through it all, the language of eugenics made it sound inevitable, rational, even natural. When ideology seeps into laws, it gains a permanence that propaganda alone can't provide. Speeches fade, posters are torn down, but a law shapes daily life with a stamp of authority. In Nazi Germany, eugenics was not just a set of beliefs held by doctors or shouted at rallies. It was written into the legal code, codified into regulations that governed who could marry, who could bear children, and who could call themselves part of the racial community. Every relationship, every certificate, every piece of paper became a test of loyalty to the state's vision of purity. Marriage was one of the first areas to come under scrutiny. The law for the protection of German blood and honour, part of the Nuremberg laws passed in 1935, made it illegal for Jews and so-called Aryans to marry or even engage in sexual relations. The law described such unions as racial defilement, a phrase that transformed intimacy into pollution, love into treason. Posters warned German women about the dangers of relationships with Jewish men, portraying them as predators, caricatured with grotesque features. Court cases followed, some sparked by rumours or denunciations, where couples were prosecuted simply for being together. The law intruded into bedrooms, turning affection into a matter of state surveillance. But the restrictions went beyond relationships with Jews. The marriage health law, passed the same year, required couples to obtain a certificate of fitness before they could marry. These certificates were issued only after medical examinations and ancestry checks. Doctors examined applicants for hereditary illnesses, mental conditions, or physical disabilities. Bureaucrats traced family trees back generations, hunting for signs of Jewish or Roma ancestry, or for relatives who had been institutionalized. A missing certificate, an uncle with epilepsy, a rumour of mixed blood. Any of these could derail a marriage application. Imagine being a young couple in 1936, engaged and excited to start a life together. You gather your papers, baptismal records, and family documents and present them at the registry office. You undergo medical exams, blood tests, perhaps even skull measurements. Weeks later, the verdict arrives, approved or denied. If approved, you marry under the blessing of the state, knowing your union has been deemed racially valuable. If denied, your future ends at a clerk's desk, your love erased by a stamp on a form. These laws extended into every aspect of family life. Birth certificates were marked with racial classifications. Ancestry certificates, called anamnesi or ancestor passports, became essential documents, proving Aryan lineage back to at least 1800. Without one, you could not hold certain jobs, join the military, or attend universities. Families scoured church registries and municipal archives, gathering baptismal and marriage records for grandparents and great-grandparents. Clerks examined the documents, searching for suspicious names or foreign origins. The process was invasive, tedious, and deeply personal, yet it became routine, another layer of bureaucracy woven into everyday life. For those who failed to produce the right ancestry, the consequences were severe. Some lost their jobs. Others were denied education. Marriages were annulled, engagements cancelled, lives disrupted. Even those with partial Jewish ancestry, called Mischlinge, were caught in the web. Their status was ambiguous, their rights limited, their futures uncertain. The law created categories of belonging and exclusion, turning genealogy into destiny. The courts enforced these laws with chilling detachment. Judges heard cases of forbidden relationships, annulled marriages, and inheritance disputes tied to racial classification. Their rulings often cited not just legal codes, but scientific-sounding arguments about hereditary health. The language of law and science blended seamlessly, making exclusion look rational, inevitable, even just. The courtroom became another arena where ideology was dressed in the clothes of order. The reach of these laws was not limited to Germany. In annexed territories, similar regulations were imposed. Poles and other Slavic populations were forbidden from marrying Germans. In some cases, relationships were punished with deportation or worse. Children born from such unions were scrutinized, sometimes taken from their mothers and placed in German families if they appeared Aryan enough. The law reached across borders, policing not just German citizens, but entire populations under occupation. What made the legal framework so powerful was how ordinary it looked. Citizens applied for certificates, filled out forms, submitted documents, attended hearings. They stood in lines at registry offices, answered questions from clerks, waited for stamps of approval. It felt bureaucratic, mundane, a matter of paperwork rather than ideology. But behind each certificate was a judgment about worth, a decision about who could marry, who could reproduce, who belonged. Propaganda supported the laws by portraying them as protective, not punitive. Posters explained the importance of healthy marriages. Pamphlets urged couples to think of the nation's future when choosing partners. School lessons emphasized the need to prevent hereditary illness. The laws were presented as hygiene for society, a way to safeguard families and ensure prosperity. Citizens were told they were not being restricted, but being protected, that the state was guiding them toward better choices. Yet the reality was far more invasive. Families lived under constant scrutiny, aware that their ancestry and health could be questioned at any time. Love became conditional, subject to approval by doctors and bureaucrats. The private became public, the intimate became political. Even the most personal decisions, whom to love, whom to marry, whether to have children, were no longer matters of choice. They were matters of law. The contradictions were stark. A healthy Aryan couple with many children was celebrated, awarded medals, praised in newspapers. A couple with the wrong ancestry or history of illness was shamed, denied, erased. The law divided the population into categories of valued and devalued, worthy and unworthy. It didn't just regulate behaviour, it reshaped identity. Citizens learned to see themselves and others through the lens of certificates, stamps and ancestry charts. Imagine carrying an Aenon pass in your pocket, knowing that without it you cannot marry, cannot advance in your career, cannot prove your worth to the state. You guard it carefully, present it when asked, use it to reassure yourself that you belong. Meanwhile, your neighbour fails to obtain one, their ancestry questioned, their rights stripped. The difference between you is not your character or your actions, but the documents you can produce. The law has drawn a line between lives that are allowed to flourish and lives that are quietly constrained. The legal framework also created a culture of surveillance. Citizens reported on each other, denouncing neighbours suspected of hiding ancestry or marrying without proper approval. Clerks investigated rumours. Courts pursued cases. Police enforced verdicts. The law turned communities into watchdogs, encouraging suspicion and betrayal. Families were torn apart, friendships broken, relationships destroyed. The law did not only regulate, it poisoned trust. By the late 1930s, the legal structure of eugenics was firmly in place. It shaped marriages, births, jobs and education. It reached into homes, schools, workplaces and churches. It made ideology into law, law into routine, routine into silence. Citizens complied because compliance was safer, because paperwork was easier than protest, because the law carried the weight of inevitability. And with each certificate issued, each marriage denied, each ancestry verified, the boundaries of belonging grew tighter, the exclusions deeper, the control more complete. The law gave eugenics its permanence. Propaganda could persuade, doctors could operate, bureaucrats could file, but only the law could bind every citizen, shaping daily life with stamps and signatures. It was not the rallies or the posters that most deeply controlled people. It was the documents they carried, the certificates they needed, the approvals they sought. The law turned ideology into fact, embedding eugenics into the very structure of society. And once it was embedded, it became the foundation for expansion. If laws could regulate marriage and ancestry, why not extend them to entire populations? If the state could forbid relationships between Jews and Aryans, why not forbid Jews from citizenship altogether? The legal framework of eugenics was not the end. It was the beginning of laws that would strip millions of people of rights, property, and eventually life. When people look back at Nazi eugenics, it is tempting to see it as a uniquely German horror, as though the idea of controlling human reproduction through sterilization, marriage bans, and classifications was invented in Berlin in the 1930s. But the uncomfortable truth is that Nazi policies did not spring fully formed out of nothing. They were part of a global movement, one that stretched from Britain to Scandinavia to the United States. Eugenics was fashionable in the early 20th century, a way for scientists, politicians, and reformers to talk about improving society. Germany did not invent it. What Germany did was push it further, strip away restraints, and carry it to its logical and most horrifying extreme. The word eugenics itself was coined by Francis Galton, a cousin of Charles Darwin, in the late 19th century. He believed that just as selective breeding could improve animals, it could also improve humans. The idea sounded scientific, progressive even, in an age obsessed with heredity, statistics, and evolution. Intellectuals, reformers, and politicians across Europe and America embraced it. Eugenic societies were founded, journals published, conferences held. It was not seen as fringe, it was seen as modern. In the United States, the movement gained enormous momentum. By the 1920s, dozens of states had passed sterilization laws aimed at people considered unfit to reproduce. The targets included the mentally ill, the disabled, criminals, and the poor. California was particularly aggressive, sterilizing tens of thousands of people, often without their consent. Other states followed suit. Court cases challenged these policies, but in 1927, the US Supreme Court upheld them in the infamous Buck v. Bell decision. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote the chilling words, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough." With that sentence, sterilization gained the highest legal endorsement in America. The United States also led in propaganda. Eugenics fairs displayed fitter families contests, where couples competed for prizes based on their health, intelligence, and appearance. Posters warned of the costs of caring for the unfit, using the same arithmetic later echoed in Nazi Germany. Films and lectures spread the message that society could be improved by preventing certain people from reproducing. For many Americans in the 1920s and 1930s, eugenics was not seen as cruelty. It was seen as reform. Across the Atlantic, Britain had its own eugenics society, attracting prominent figures from science and politics. Although Britain did not pass sterilization laws on the same scale as the United States, the movement influenced debates on social policy, immigration, and health. Scandinavian countries went further. Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Finland all passed sterilization laws, some of which remained in effect for decades after the war. Thousands were sterilized in the name of public health and social improvement. The influence of these global movements on Germany was direct. German eugenicists attended international conferences, corresponded with colleagues abroad, and read journals filled with studies from the United States and Britain. They admired the efficiency of American sterilization programs and cited them as models. Nazi propaganda even pointed to US laws as proof that sterilization was not radical but mainstream. When critics accused Germany of cruelty, officials could point across the ocean and say, "Look, America does the same." The connections went deeper still. American philanthropies funded German researchers in the 1920s and early 1930s. The Rockefeller Foundation, for example, supported institutes of racial biology in Germany, not to promote Nazi ideology specifically, but to advance what was then seen as modern science. The lines between legitimate research and ideological pseudoscience blurred easily in that environment. By the time the Nazis came to power, the infrastructure was already in place, supported in part by international respectability. Immigration policy was also influenced by eugenics worldwide. The United States imposed quotas in the 1920s that restricted immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, based on the belief that these populations were biologically inferior. Canada and Australia had their own restrictions, often tied to race and health. The idea that nations could and should control their populations based on biological criteria was not unique to Germany. It was widespread, normalised, respectable. The global eugenics movement shared the same flaws everywhere. Simplistic assumptions about heredity, disregard for environment and poverty, blind faith in statistics, and a willingness to reduce people to categories. Whether in California, Stockholm, or Berlin, the logic was the same. If society wanted to improve, it had to control reproduction. The differences were in scale, enforcement, and brutality. Nazi Germany took what others had suggested, what others had tried, and pushed it beyond any boundary. Imagine being a scientist in 1930, attending an international conference on eugenics. You hear papers from American researchers about sterilization programs, from Swedish officials about social health laws, from German academics about racial hygiene. The tone is calm, professional, optimistic. Charts are shown, statistics cited, slides projected. There are no shouts, no banners, no overt hatred. It feels like science. But beneath the graphs and polite applause lies a shared assumption that some lives are less worthy, and that the state has the right to decide who should reproduce. What distinguished Nazi Germany was not the idea of eugenics itself, but the speed, scope, and ruthlessness of its implementation. Where other countries sterilized thousands, Germany sterilized hundreds of thousands. Where others restricted marriage, Germany annulled marriages and criminalized relationships. Where others stopped at sterilization, Germany advanced to euthanasia and mass murder. The framework was global, but the extremity was uniquely Nazi. The echoes of global eugenics continued long after the war. In the United States, sterilization laws remained on the books in some states until the 1970s. In Sweden, sterilizations continued into the 1970s as well, often targeting women deemed socially unfit. In Canada, Indigenous women were sterilized without consent well into the late 20th century. The shadow of eugenics was long, and its roots were not confined to Nazi Germany. The uncomfortable truth is that Nazi doctors and officials could, and did, justify their actions by pointing outward. They saw themselves as part of a global movement, not as outliers. They believed they were leading the way, taking science to its logical conclusion. When they sterilized, they cited America. When they banned marriages, they cited Scandinavia. When they measured skulls, they cited Britain. The global eugenics movement didn't excuse what happened in Germany, but it helped enable it. It gave the ideology a cloak of legitimacy, a sense that it was modern, scientific, progressive. For ordinary people in Germany, this global context mattered too. When newspapers reported on sterilization laws, they sometimes mentioned that America had them as well. When officials explained restrictions, They framed them as part of a broader international trend. Citizens were told that Germany was not being cruel, but keeping up with modern science, joining the civilized world in improving its population. The international respectability of eugenics made it easier for Germans to accept their own laws. Looking back, it is striking how quickly the scientific community shifted after the war. By 1945, eugenics had become a dirty word forever associated with Nazi atrocities. Scientists distanced themselves, journals were renamed, conferences rebranded. What had once been respectable was suddenly disavowed, but the ideas lingered, often in subtler forms. In genetic counselling, in debates about population control, in lingering prejudices about race and heredity. The global story of eugenics did not end with the fall of Berlin. It simply changed its language. The Nazi project was the most visible and horrifying branch of a tree whose roots ran across the world. To understand it is not just to look at Germany, but to look at California, London, Stockholm, and beyond. The ideology of purity, the obsession with heredity, the willingness to control reproduction, they were not uniquely German. They were global currents that swept across nations before converging most violently in the heart of Europe. And as Germany pushed eugenics to its extreme, the question for others became unavoidable. How far were they willing to go themselves? Some scaled back, horrified by the Nazi example. Others continued, quietly, in clinics and institutions far from the headlines. The story of eugenics was never only about one nation. It was about a world that flirted with the idea of engineering humanity. A world that gave Nazi Germany both inspiration and cover. By the time sterilizations, certificates, and even killings were underway, the German public was not entirely ignorant. The buses with painted windows were seen on village roads. The chimneys of institutions smoked day and night. Families compared stories, noticing how many relatives died suddenly of pneumonia or heart failure. Teachers drilled children on the cost of defective lives. Doctors signed forms that no longer looked like medicine. It was visible, if not in every detail, then in outline. And yet, only a few spoke out. Most people remained silent, whether through belief, fear, or resignation. The silence was not absolute. There were moments of resistance, individuals and groups who dared to push back against policies that were framed as science, but revealed themselves as cruelty. One of the most striking voices was that of Bishop Clemens August von Galen, who in 1941 delivered sermons denouncing the killings of the disabled. He spoke from his pulpit about the buses, about the rumours, about the injustice of deciding whose lives were worth living. His word spread quickly, carried by parishioners and whispered in towns. For a moment, the regime flinched. Hitler ordered the official halt of the T4 program, at least on paper, though decentralized killings continued. Von Galen was not arrested, partly because his popularity made him too dangerous to martyr, but his defiance was rare, a single loud voice against a tide of silence. Other clergy also resisted, though often quietly. Some priests spoke carefully in sermons, condemning killing without naming the regime. Nuns in institutions tried to protect children by falsifying records or hiding them. In a few cases, church networks smuggled patients away. These acts were risky, and those who attempted them knew the consequences could be severe. Yet compared to the scale of the policies, the resistance was small, scattered, fragile. Doctors and nurses had opportunities to resist too. A few did, writing false diagnoses to shield patients, delaying paperwork, or quietly protecting individuals they knew. Some families convinced sympathetic doctors to declare their children curable rather than defective. But for every doctor who resisted, hundreds complied. Fear played a role, but so did belief in the ideology, ambition, and the ease of going along. Silence in the wards was often louder than protest. Among ordinary citizens, reactions varied. Some truly believed the propaganda. They accepted that sterilization was hygienic, that euthanasia was merciful, that costs mattered more than individual lives. They saw posters, read articles, watched films, and nodded along. Others suspected cruelty but chose not to ask questions. They told themselves it was not their concern, that the state knew best, that their duty was to their families, not to distant patients and institutions. A few actively denounced neighbours or relatives, reporting marriages, illnesses, or ancestry that could trigger investigations. Most simply kept quiet. Silence was not always agreement. Fear was a powerful force. To criticise openly was dangerous. To speak too loudly about suspicions risked being labelled disloyal, or worse, targeted yourself. People had seen how easily reputations were destroyed, how quickly files could be opened, how swiftly lives could be upended by a mark on a form. Silence became survival. In that silence, cruelty thrived. Imagine being a villager near Hadamar, one of the T-War killing centres. You see the buses arrive, their windows painted over. You notice the smoke from the chimney, the smell that lingers in the air. You hear the whispers from workers about what is happening inside. You wonder about your cousin, transferred there months ago, who has since died of a pneumonia. You know deep down what is happening. But you also know what happens to those who speak too loudly. So you keep your thoughts to yourself, discuss them only in hushed tones with trusted friends, and carry on with daily life. The few who resisted openly often did so from positions of relative safety. Church leaders, respected figures, or individuals with enough influence to make arrest risky. Ordinary citizens rarely had that protection. Their silence was not always cowardice. Sometimes it was calculation, a way of protecting their families from the same machinery that consumed so many others. But silence, whatever its reason, had the same effect. It allowed the policies to continue. There were also those who resisted not out of morality, but out of personal connection. Parents fought to protect their children, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. Letters survive from mothers pleading with institutions to spare their sons or daughters, describing their small joys, their potential, their humanity. Some bribed officials, others begged doctors, others tried to keep their children hidden at home. The tragedy was that without status or influence, most could do little. Their voices were drowned out by the weight of the system. In occupied territories, resistance was sometimes stronger. In Poland and other regions, where Nazi racial policies targeted entire populations, communities hid children, protected families, and resisted deportations. But even there, silence was common. Occupation was brutal, and the risks of resistance immense. For every act of defiance, there were many who looked away, unable or unwilling to fight a system that held all the power. The silence of the scientific community was perhaps the most devastating. German doctors, psychiatrists, and scientists could have spoken out in numbers that might have mattered. Instead, most stayed quiet. They published articles, attended conferences, refined sterilization techniques, and dissected corpses from experiments. Their silence was not passive. It was participation. By choosing to see ideology as science, they legitimized policies that destroyed lives. The role of silence is easy to underestimate. It did not only allow cruelty to continue, it made it appear accepted. When few protested, officials could claim the policies had public support. When neighbours whispered but did not act, the regime could proceed with confidence. Silence created the illusion of consensus, the appearance that society agreed. And in authoritarian systems, appearance is often enough. At the same time, small acts of resistance remind us that not everyone accepted what was happening. The sermons of von Galen, the quiet protection offered by some doctors, the pleas of parents, the whispered doubts of neighbours, these were cracks in the wall of compliance. They were not enough to stop the machinery, but they show that humanity was not entirely extinguished. Still, when measured against the vast scale of sterilization, euthanasia, and experiments, the balance was clear. Silence outweighed resistance. The machinery of eugenics relied not just on laws, doctors, and bureaucrats, but on millions of ordinary people choosing not to see too much, not to ask too many questions, not to risk too much. Resistance was rare, silence was everywhere, and as silence spread, the regime was free to take the next step. If sterilization and euthanasia could proceed without widespread revolt, why not extend the logic further? If the disabled and ill could be eliminated quietly, why not apply the same methods to Jews, Roma, and other groups deemed undesirable? The silence had already answered. It told the regime that the public would not rise up, that protest would be limited, that the machinery could keep moving. When the war began in 1939, the machinery of eugenics was already humming in Germany. Sterilizations had become routine. The T4 program had shown how institutions could be turned into centres of killing. Propaganda had taught citizens to think of lives in terms of costs and burdens. Laws had divided society into the fit and the unfit. Psychiatry and medicine had already been twisted into instruments of ideology. What war provided was not a new idea, but a new scale, a stage large enough to apply the logic of eugenics to entire populations. War blurred lines that had once restrained the state, however faintly. In peacetime, killing patients in institutions required secrecy, deception, and euphemism. In wartime, killing could be reframed as necessity, as strategy, as part of a larger struggle for survival. Death became not just acceptable, but inevitable. The war created chaos, and within that chaos, the machinery of eugenics expanded without restraint. Occupied Poland became one of the first laboratories. Here, the regime could test policies on millions, far from the eyes of ordinary German citizens. Hospitals in occupied territories were cleared of patients, many shot or starved on the spot. Others were deported to camps where killing was immediate. Doctors and officials no longer needed to write polite letters to families or disguise causes of death. In war, the pretense of mercy fell away. The killings became open, systematic, unhidden. At the same time, the logic of sterilization was applied to populations deemed racially undesirable. Polish and Soviet women were sterilized in large numbers, often through brutal experiments with chemicals or radiation. Men were castrated, women subjected to forced abortions. These acts were not framed as punishments for crimes, but as preventive measures for the future. Entire peoples were seen as defective lineages to be cut off at the root. The same logic that had sterilized thousands in Germany now sterilized nations. The war also accelerated the theft of children. In occupied territories, German officials searched for children with Aryan features, blonde hair, blue eyes, fair skin, who could be taken from their families and placed with German parents. To the regime, these children were valuable genetic material, stolen to strengthen the population. Their original families were erased, their languages forbidden, their identities reshaped. The logic was the same as in sterilization and euthanasia. Decide which lives are valuable and dispose of the rest. The invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 took this laboratory to an even greater scale. Behind the front lines, special units, Einsatzgruppen, moved from village to village, shooting Jews, Roma, and others deemed undesirable. These killings were not random. They were guided by the same ideology that had fueled eugenics, that some groups were biologically inferior, parasites weakening the body of the nation. Mass graves replaced operating tables, bullets replaced scalpels, but the logic was the same. The connection between eugenics and the Holocaust is not just metaphorical. Many of the doctors and officials who had overseen sterilization and the T4 program moved directly into the machinery of genocide. The gas chambers built in killing centres for the disabled were prototypes for those at Auschwitz and Sobibor. The same carbon monoxide cylinders were used, the same crematoria built, the same methods of deception employed. The victims changed from patients to entire populations, but the structure remained. T4 was the rehearsal. The Holocaust was the performance. The language of hygiene carried over as well. Jews were described as a disease, a contamination, a plague that needed to be eradicated. Propaganda posters depicted them as lice or parasites infecting the body of the nation. Doctors and scientists spoke of cleansing Europe, of protecting the future, of purifying the gene pool. Killing was not presented as murder. It was presented as treatment, surgery, disinfection. The words of medicine disguised the reality of extermination. War also provided justification for experiments on a new scale. In the camps, doctors tested vaccines, sterilization methods, poisons, and endurance. Prisoners became guinea pigs in a vast laboratory justified by the needs of war. If soldiers might face malaria, then infect prisoners to test cures. If pilots might freeze in the ocean, then freeze prisoners to measure survival. The cruelty of the psychiatric wards expanded into the cruelty of the camps, now multiplied by the millions who passed through their gates. Imagine arriving at Auschwitz in 1943. You step off the train, disoriented, exhausted, clutching the hand of a child. A doctor stands at the platform, glancing briefly at each arrival, pointing left or right. One direction means labour, the other means death. In that moment, medicine and eugenics merge fully. A doctor's gesture decides who is fit, who is unfit, who will live, who will die. It is triage not for healing, but for extermination. The calm authority of the white coat, the clipboard, the pen, all used to mask murder as selection. War made this possible because it allowed ideology to merge with strategy. Killing the disabled, sterilizing women, deporting children, exterminating Jews and Roma, all of it was framed as strengthening the war efforts. Resources would not be wasted on the unfit, as the gene pool would not be polluted by defective lineages. Soldiers would not be weakened by parasites in their midst. War made extermination look like necessity, even patriotism. The silence of the public, already deep, grew deeper in wartime. Bombings, shortages, conscription, and death consumed attention. Ordinary Germans were less likely to ask questions about what was happening in distant camps and occupied lands. Rumours spread, but they were drowned out by the daily struggle to survive. For many, it was easier not to know, easier to believe official reassurances, easier to stay silent. The war itself became a shield, hiding atrocities behind the chaos of battle. The culmination of eugenics and war was the final solution, the systematic extermination of Jews, Roma, and others across Europe. It was not separate from eugenics. It was its extension. The logic that had sterilised a woman in a clinic now killed her entire family in a camp. The questionnaires that had marked patients for death now marked entire populations. The gas chambers of T4 became the gas chambers of Auschwitz. The ideology of purity, once focused on individuals, now encompassed millions. The Holocaust was not just genocide. It was eugenics expanded, weaponized by war, justified by science, and carried out with industrial efficiency. The doctors, bureaucrats, and scientists who had honed their skills in sterilization courts and psychiatric wards found new opportunities in ghettos and camps. The same language, the same logic, the same procedures, applied now not to thousands but to millions. By the time the war neared its end, the laboratory had consumed half of Europe. Families torn apart, children stolen, women sterilized, men shot in fields, entire communities gassed in chambers. The dream of racial hygiene, born in academic journals and international conferences, carried through courtrooms and hospitals, had reached its ultimate conclusion. War had provided the cover, the justification, the machinery, and the result was one of the greatest horrors in human history. When the war finally ended in 1945, the ruins of Europe told one story, but the files, camps and testimonies revealed another. Allied soldiers liberated towns and cities, but it was when they opened the gates of concentration camps that the full scope of what had been done in the name of medicine and science began to emerge. Starving survivors stumbled out of barracks. Piles of corpses lay unburied. Medical equipment sat abandoned in infirmaries where experiments had been performed. Notes and ledgers lay scattered in offices, filled with lists of names, measurements and procedures. The world had to confront not only genocide, but the fact that much of it had been carried out under the authority of doctors and scientists. At first, the Allies did not fully understand the scale. They knew the Nazis had committed atrocities, but the details of sterilizations, euthanasia, and medical experiments came to light gradually. Liberators found hospitals where disabled patients had been killed, crematoria at psychiatric institutions, files from the T4 program. They interviewed survivors who described injections, surgeries, and experiments. Doctors themselves were captured, interrogated, and confronted with their records. The picture that formed was not one of rogue criminals hiding in shadows, but of respected professionals who had put their skills at the service of ideology. The decision to hold trials at Nuremberg was an attempt to confront this truth publicly. The first and most famous trial was for major war criminals, political and military leaders. But soon after came the doctors' trial, held in 1946-1947. 23 physicians and administrators were put on trial for their roles in sterilizations, euthanasia, and experiments on prisoners. The courtroom was filled not only with judges and lawyers, but with survivors who testified about what had been done to them. For the first time, the world heard directly from those who had been treated as experiments. The prosecutors laid out the evidence. Records of freezing experiments at Dachau, notes from malaria experiments, descriptions of surgical mutilations at Ravensbrück, files from sterilization clinics. Survivors described being injected with unknown substances, exposed to cold, cut open without anesthesia. They spoke of children taken for twin experiments, of mothers sterilized without consent, of men castrated under the guise of research. The testimony was calm, detailed, devastating. Each story revealed how far the medical profession had strayed from its duty. The defence of the doctors was chilling in its familiarity. Many claimed they had simply followed orders. Others insisted their work was for the good of science, that the data they produced might benefit humanity. Some pointed to the global eugenics movement, noting that sterilization laws had existed in the United States and Scandinavia. They argued that their work was not uniquely German, not uniquely criminal. The line between ideology and science, they suggested, had been blurred everywhere. But the tribunal rejected these defences. The judges ruled that following orders was no excuse for crimes against humanity, and that scientific research without consent was not research at all but torture. 16 of the defendants were found guilty, and 7 were sentenced to death. Others received prison sentences. Beyond the verdicts, the trial established a precedent that medicine could not hide behind the cloak of science, that doctors could not use research as a shield for cruelty, that the Hippocratic oath meant something even in war. One of the most important outcomes of the trial was the creation of the Nuremberg Code, a set of principles governing medical research. It declared that voluntary consent of the subject was essential, that experiments must avoid unnecessary suffering, that they must be conducted by qualified professionals, and that subjects must be free to withdraw at any time. These principles, born out of the horrors revealed at Nuremberg, became the foundation for modern research ethics. They were not perfect, and enforcement was inconsistent, but they were a line drawn in response to what had happened. The trials also confronted the legacy of eugenics more broadly. Sterilization policies were not unique to Germany, but in the wake of the war, they were suddenly cast in a different light. What had once been considered progressive in the United States or Sweden now looked dangerous, tainted by association with Nazi crimes. Some countries quietly scaled back their programs. Others continued them for decades, but without the public confidence they once enjoyed. Eugenics, as a respectable movement, was dead. Its language had been forever linked with Auschwitz and Dachau. For survivors, trials were only a beginning. Many carried scars, both physical and emotional, from experiments and sterilizations. Women sterilized against their will were denied families. Men who had been mutilated struggled with shame and loss. Survivors of experiments bore lifelong injuries. Testifying at Nuremberg gave some a chance to be heard, but it did not erase the suffering. Nor did it always bring justice. Many doctors who had participated in atrocities were never tried, never punished, returning quietly to medical practice in post-war Germany. Some continued their careers, their pasts hidden or ignored. The broader German public also faced a reckoning. Many had known something, or suspected, or whispered, but after the war, the evidence was undeniable. The files, the camps, the testimonies, the ashes in the crematoria, all told the story of a nation that had allowed medicine to be corrupted. The silence of the past could no longer be maintained. And yet, for many, the confrontation was too painful, too dangerous. Silence continued, reshaped as forgetfulness. Families rarely spoke of relatives lost in institutions. Communities avoided discussing the buses that had once driven through their streets. The Nuremberg trials tried to impose clarity on a story filled with ambiguity. They declared who was guilty, who was responsible, who had crossed the line from medicine to murder. But history rarely fits neatly into verdicts. The trials could not fully capture the scale of complicity, the depth of silence, the weight of ideology. They punished some, exposed much, but left questions lingering. How had so many gone along? How had science been so easily twisted? How could ordinary doctors and nurses betray their patients so completely? Imagine sitting in that courtroom in 1947, listening as survivor after survivor takes the stand. A woman describes being sterilized without consent, her dreams of motherhood stolen. A man recounts freezing experiments, his body convulsing as doctors took notes. A mother speaks of her twins taken by Mengele, never seen again. The defendants sit in their benches, some stone-faced, some defiant, some pale with shame. The air is heavy, the silence punctuated by the voices of those who had been silenced for years. For the first time, the world listens. The legacy of Nuremberg was not only in its verdicts, but in its warning. Science, when divorced from ethics, can become a weapon. Medicine, when tied to ideology, can become murder. Bureaucracy, when stripped of humanity, can become a conveyor belt to death. The trials expose these truths, not as abstract ideas, but as lived horrors. They force the world to confront the fact that the white coat, the clipboard, the syringe could be as dangerous as any gun when guided by cruelty. And yet, the story did not end with the trials. The ideas of eugenics did not vanish. They lingered in sterilization programs abroad, in debates about population control, in the darker corners of genetics. The Nuremberg Code was a milestone, but its principles were violated repeatedly in the decades that followed. The shadow of Nazi eugenics stretched far beyond 1945, shaping the way science, medicine, and ethics would be debated for generations. The war ended, the trials were held, the words of the Nuremberg Code were written down, and yet the shadow of eugenics did not vanish with the chimneys of the camps. Ideas are harder to destroy than buildings, and the ideology of controlling human reproduction, of deciding which lives are valuable and which are burdens, lingered long after the doctors were sentenced and the records were filed away. The world declared that it had learned its lesson, but beneath the surface, the assumptions of eugenics seeped quietly into policies, debates, and practices that continued for decades. In the United States, sterilization laws did not disappear immediately. The Supreme Court decision in Buck v. Bell, with its chilling declaration that 3 generations of imbeciles are enough, was never formally overturned. States continued to sterilize people considered unfit well into the 1960s and 1970s. Targets include the mentally ill, the disabled, the poor, and disproportionately minorities and women of colour. Many were sterilised without consent, tricked into signing forms they could not read, or pressured under the guise of medical necessity. For them, the end of the war in Europe had not ended the ideology, it had only shifted its location. Scandinavia, often imagined as progressive, carried out its own sterilisation programs for decades. In Sweden, tens of thousands were sterilised between the 1930s and 1970s, many of them women deemed promiscuous, poor, or socially unfit. Norway, Denmark, and Finland had similar programs. The justification was often framed in terms of public health and social welfare, but the logic was the same as in Germany. Some lives were better prevented than allowed. The shadow of eugenics stretched across welfare states as much as dictatorships. In Canada, Indigenous women were sterilised in alarming numbers, often without consent, well into the late 20th century. Hospitals and social workers decided that these women were unfit mothers, their fertility treated as a problem to be solved by surgery. Similar stories emerged in Australia, where Aboriginal women were subjected to forced sterilizations and the removal of children. The connection to Nazi Germany was rarely mentioned, but the logic was identical. Deciding who should and should not reproduce. The shadow extended into the language of science as well. Genetics replaced eugenics as a field, distancing itself from the horrors of the past, but debates about population control, hereditary illness, and desirable traits often echoed old assumptions. In the 1950s and 1960s, as birth control spread, and governments worried about overpopulation, new conversations began about how to limit reproduction among the poor and disadvantaged. Policies of coercive sterilisation, disguised as family planning, targeted the same groups eugenics once had. Even in medical research, the lessons of Nuremberg were not always honoured. The Nuremberg Code called for voluntary consent, for the avoidance of unnecessary suffering, for respect for the autonomy of subjects. Yet in the decades that followed, studies violated these principles repeatedly. The Tuskegee syphilis study in the United States left black men untreated for decades to observe the course of disease without their informed consent. In other cases, prisoners, soldiers, and institutionalized people were used as subjects for radiation experiments, chemical exposure, and drug trials. The white coat again cloaked cruelty. The language of science again disguised exploitation. The shadow is also cultural. The idea that some lives are worth less than others did not disappear. It lingers in subtle forms, in prejudice against the disabled, in the stigma of mental illness, in debates about healthcare costs. When societies talk about burdens, drains, or undesirables, they echo the arithmetic once written on Nazi posters. When governments debate who deserves medical care, or who should have children, the language sometimes slips back into the same patterns of value and worth. Advances in genetics and reproductive technology have revived old questions in new forms. Prenatal testing allows parents to know if a child will be born with certain conditions. Some choose to terminate pregnancies, framing the choice as compassion, as prevention of suffering. Others see in this the shadow of eugenics, the idea that disabled lives are less worthy, that prevention is better than inclusion. Gene editing, too, raises questions. If science can remove traits deemed undesirable, who decides which traits those are? Where is the line between therapy and selection, between healing and engineering? The questions are not hypothetical. They are the modern echoes of a history that once declared whole groups unfit. Imagine standing in a modern clinic, hearing a doctor explain genetic risks, probabilities, options for intervention. The language is calm, scientific, compassionate, and yet beneath it lies the same dilemma faced a century ago. Who decides what kind of lives are worth living? The tools are new, the words different, but the ethical fault line is the same. The shadow of eugenics is there, waiting in the background of every decision about genes, reproduction, and choice. The memory of Nazi crimes is often invoked as a warning, and rightly so. The The Holocaust revealed what happened when eugenics is carried to its extreme. Yet the warning is complicated by the persistence of policies elsewhere, long after 1945. Forced sterilizations in the Americas, welfare sterilization in Scandinavia, population control in Asia, all show that the world did not simply turn away. It continued, often quietly, often framed as progress. The shadow does not announce itself. It lingers in silence, in bureaucracy, in the quiet decisions of doctors, social workers, and policy makers. The survivors of sterilization and experiments carry that shadow in their own lives. Many spoke only decades later, when they found the courage or when governments finally acknowledged the wrongs. Some received apologies, some compensation, many nothing at all. Their testimonies echo those of earlier survivors, voices reminding us that cruelty often hides in procedure, that loss is often buried under paperwork. Their lives remind us that the shadow of eugenics is not abstract. It is personal, intimate, written into the bodies and families of those affected. The Nuremberg Code and later declarations like the Helsinki Declaration were attempts to guard against the return of such abuses. They established principles of consent, dignity, and respect. But codes are only words unless enforced. The fact that violations continued after the war shows how fragile those protections are, how easily they can be ignored when science is hungry for data, when governments are hungry for control, when ideology whispers that some lives matter less. The shadow is visible too in memory. Museums, memorials, and textbooks remind new generations of what happened, but the temptation to forget is strong. Families still carry shame from sterilizations. Communities still whisper about lost relatives. Societies still avoid confronting their complicity. The buses with painted windows that once drove through villages in Germany are remembered now only in plaques and exhibitions. But for those who saw them, who smelled the smoke, who lost children or siblings, the shadow never disappeared. The haunting of eugenics lies not only in its history, but in its persistence. It tells us that science is never neutral, that medicine is never free of ideology, that bureaucracy can be as deadly as bullets when it devalues lives. It tells us that silence enables cruelty, that fear creates complicity, that small steps, sterilizations, certificates, classifications, can become rehearsals for mass killing. It tells us that vigilance is not a choice but a necessity, because the shadow does not vanish. It waits, always ready to return in new forms, under new names, wearing new disguises. And so the story does not end with the trials, or with the collapse of the Third Reich. It extends forward, into our own time, into debates about genetics, disability, healthcare and choice. The haunting lies in the questions we still ask, the lines we still struggle to draw, the silence we still allow. The shadow of eugenics is not only in history books. It is in us, in the structures we build, the words we use, the decisions we make. And so, from the quiet corridors of psychiatric wards to the vast machinery of camps, from sterilization courts to the Nuremberg courtroom, the story of eugenics in Nazi Germany traces a line of chilling consistency. It began with measurements and classifications, with charts and certificates, with the calm voices of doctors explaining heredity. It grew into operations and experiments, sterilizations and euthanasia, hidden in hospitals and institutions. It expanded into war, into occupied lands, into the systematic extermination of entire populations. And when it finally ended, it left not only millions dead, but an enduring reminder of how science can be bent, how law can be corrupted, how silence can become complicity. What lingers is not only the horror of what happened, but the recognition that the language of eugenics never truly disappears. It hides in statistics about burdens and costs, in debates about who deserves care, in conversations about perfection and purity. It is there in the temptation to believe that some lives matter more than others, that some futures are worth more investment, that human value can be measured like numbers on a ledger. The lesson is not locked in the past. It is here, in every choice about medicine, law, and science. It is in the responsibility to remember that behind every file, every chart, every diagnosis is a person with a name, a family, a life. It is in the need to resist the comfort of silence, to question the arithmetic of cruelty, to hold on to the simple truth that worth cannot be stamped or certified, only lived. And as the world drifts further from those years, as memories fade into history, the shadow remains. To tell the story is to keep that shadow visible, to remind ourselves that it can return in new shapes, under new names, in new places. The haunting of eugenics is not only what was done, but what could be done again if vigilance falters. So when the files are closed, when the voices of survivors grow quiet, when the trials become pages in books, what remains is the choice each generation must make: to see the shadow, to name it, and to refuse to let it take root again,